Children Learning and Cognition. This course is brought to you by Gilad James Mystery School. Learn more at giladjames.com. Introduction. At the end of the episode, one of the students, called Acerola, actually a nickname, faced with the need to repeat the information given by the teacher, went towards the map and transposed the history of Napoleonic invasions to the current reality of Rio. The countries became hills, each one of them managed by a head, who behaved as a Brazilian druglord. The trade of manufactured goods and raw materials, which were pivotal to the emergent industrial capitalism, became drug trade. Brazil, which was a colony of Portugal at that time, became an immense and available space for occupation, conquer and mightiness. But in Acerola's narrative there was still a great lord who wanted to be the biggest leader of all the neighborhood, and for this aim he sent agents he trusted to govern the conquered territories and eliminate possible or real enemies. Acerola's explanation reveals that he has clear in his mind that the Portuguese royal family had to escape to Brazil because of territorial dispute and power interests in 19th century, but we cannot ensure if he knows that. As he repeats the teacher's story, he talks about Napoleon, and not about some druglord, and about Europe, not Rio de Janeiro. In other words, by now we cannot be sure that Acerola understood that the invasions and contentions of the 19th century did not happen in the same terms, motivations and conditions which outline many events that we witness nowadays. This lecture is about Acerola's speech, and the learning questions it arises. Can we assert that Acerola really learned the teacher's lesson? What criteria should we employ to say that he learned it or not? If he only had repeated the teacher's words, this could mean learning. To what extent the interference of his previous knowledge about social problems in Rio over those historical facts ceases to be learning and starts to be free interpretation. And as to the map, which was a didactic artifact for both the teacher and Acerola, is it the same object in both narratives, or could it be, respectively, a map of Western world and afterwards a map of Rio de Janeiro? Or could it be a third thing whose existence lasted only during the time that Acerola told his version of the story? Whatever the answers we offer to these questions, they do not belie the fact that Acerola actively interacted not only with the contents expressed by the teacher in such a way to deeply alter them, but he also changed the object around which the lesson was taught, the map. Therefore, our answers must take into account his important agentic actions over the classroom setting, and the fact that these actions are closely related to his degree of learning. To argue about these issues, this lecture aims to present the theoretical basis for observing learning as an agentic accomplishment based on a two-way effectment between the learner and the environment, and as an adaptive reorganization of a complex system. Hutchins, 1995, p. 289. As we define this theoretical basis, we need to raise three important criteria in order to not only discuss issues brought up on the observation of Acerola's actions in the classroom, but also establish how we can adjust this concept of learning to institutional terms. What is the view of cognition which allows us to recognize learning not only as internalization of concepts but also an action over the environment? What is the constitution of the learning environment which allows this twofold relationship, through which means it is possible to observe the didactic artifacts found in this environment, and how they contribute and are representative for learning as a cognitive action of constitutive interchange between person and environment? These three criteria lead us to observe cognition in a distributed fashion, in order to postulate that the use of the environment in the cognitive elaboration does enhances cognitive action, through the access to more resources available than the neural apparatus. This idea, called the distributed cognition hypothesis, enables us to establish for the learning environment the status of a cognitive niche, a dynamic setting where cognitive actions modify the cognizor's behavior and also the environment features and properties, including everything which can be perceived in there. As to the learning niches, it is important to discuss the idea of affordances, features that emerge from the meaningful relationship between species and environment and are fundamental in the discussion about concept formation, learning, and the value of cognitive artifacts employed in didactic practices. To speak about these issues we are guided by works on cognition which propose a specific mode of observing human actions and cognitive behaviors which establishes that the very act of thinking is not bounded to the brain and the visual system, rather, mind is constructed in a process that includes brain, body and the environment around them. Under this view, the person is someone able to, through reasoning, planning, learning and many other cognitive actions, change himself/herself in the place where he or she lives, interacts and develops. These premises enable us to relate ideas on environmental perception to facts of conceptualization and meaning construction. Ultimately, it broadens our understanding of what is learning and favors the formulation of pedagogical projects based on the understanding of the learner's cognitive behavior in the classroom environment. In this sense, pedagogical projects which observe the artifacts of the environment as learning resources can accomplish a more productive and authentic relationship among the learner, the contents to be learned and the forms of learning. The next sections briefly discuss the distributed cognition hypothesis, which is the context of the studies on cognition which emerge from the possibility of observing the ecological dimension of the aspects related to cognitive actions, their motivations and effects. This perspective leads us to recognize the cognitive niches as a level of analysis for studies of learning within the school institution. Subsumed to the idea of cognitive niche, we stress the notion of affordance as a central component of the niche, and the forms of thinking about learning in cognitive niches through the perspective of the detection of affordances. We will focus specifically on didactic actions which can conduct to good or bad results in classroom activities. The distributed cognition hypothesis. The distributed cognition hypothesis, Clark and Chalmers, 1998, Hutchins, 1995, 2000, Sina, 2005, 2010, Bardun, 2011, among others, brings the idea that the continuity among brain, body and the environment structures cognition. Following this premise, studies on distributed cognition are concerned about identifying and describing cognitive processes in terms of the relationship between person and environment. The works affiliated to this hypothesis propose the rupture of the boundaries between internal and external representations and domains of experience, and generate new prospects for the view of what cognition is, no longer biased to the internal or the external factors which compose it, but requiring mutual and constitutive relationships between these domains. Zhang and Patel, 2006, Franks, 2011, which are events through cognitive processes. The structural connections between species and environment are basically justified by the need to access extra material and symbolic resources that cannot be found in the brain, in order to accomplish the cognitive task posited to the person. The possibility of implementing these connections is recognized as an evolutionary feat of the Homo sapiens and some other species, and it exists for the fact that the complexity of our neural system sanctions the activity of incorporating features not foreseen by the genetics. This property demands the search for environmental artifacts in order to create, acquire, manipulate, and storage information and knowledge, to fulfill specific purposes of cognitive action and make correct and suitable decisions. The ideas about the nature of cognition in an extended and distributed perspective bring, as a real challenge, the need to investigate the boundaries of the units of analysis in studies of cognition, and the set of mechanisms involved in cognitive processes. Hutchins, 2000. These two axes of investigation on cognition must take into account all domains of human existence, which are now seen not in an atomistic fashion, but as an integrated universe. They are respectively related to the concepts of cognitive niches and affordances, hence the importance to take into consideration these two constructs in the study of cognition in settings where cognitive processes and actions are at stake. In order to do this, we assume the non-previous ontological existence of information and features in the environment, because they cannot be found outside the cognizing field. Rather, the emergence of these features is associated to our comprehension that the identification of a given property of an object, which can be found in several other objects, is related to a particular use that we make of it. Bardun, 2011. According to this, it is possible to assert that the very perceptual detection of an object and its properties is constituted by the goals of physical and cognitive actions which justify its presence in that environment. In other words, we will not see anything in an object if it is not included in the universe of action possibilities in a given domain. We will not even see, in a perceptual sense, this object. The constituents of the external domains can assume several and different tasks in cognitive construction. They were summarized in Zhang and Patel, 2006, p. 335, and are transcribed below. Provide short-term or long-term memory aids so that memory load can be reduced. Provide information that can be directly perceived and used such that little effortful processing is needed to interpret and formulate the information explicitly. Provide knowledge and skills that are unavailable from internal representations. Support perceptual operators that can recognize features easily and make inferences directly. Change the nature of a task by generating more efficient action sequences. Stop time and support perceptual rehearsal to make invisible and transient information visible and sustainable. Aid processability by limiting abstraction. Anchor and structure cognitive behavior without conscious awareness. Determine decision-making strategies through accuracy maximization and effort minimization. All the tasks stressed above are useful for studies on education and learning. For example, the first one seems to be the main purpose of writing in a broad sense. They are collective memory banks, Donald, 1991, p. 311, which help us deal with the need for quick calculi, and retain and transmit information and knowledge. The map used in Acerolas, and the teachers, we need to say, history lesson fits many of them, including two, when Acerola employed the map of the 19th century's Western world as if it could portray the reality of 21st century's Rio de Janeiro, hills instead of countries and druglords instead of kings and emperors, he saved the students and himself from mentally launching themselves towards a space and time which they did not participate. So he liberated their minds for the important ideas of the lesson, the circumstances which led to the Portuguese royal family getaway in 1808. The duty of recognizing how external representations can contribute for a satisfactory learning task can be better accomplished if every cognitive action is done with clear purposes. They define not only conceptual choices, but also the perception of the objects and their properties, the facts that occur in learning settings, the quality of the use of the features proposed by Jung and Patel, and, since other people are part of the environment, the ways that the person will interpret the actions of his/her co-specifics. In this sense, goals, and also the problems that must be faced in order to fulfill them, are a kind of an external regulation which structures our actions, conceptualizations and joint commitments. Tomellini and Castelfranchi, 2006, Carassa, Colombetti, and Morganti, 2008. Therefore, we can say that our cognition is essentially normatized by these features. Normativity is present in the selection of the functions and boundaries of the environment, the perception of its features and the forms of relationship with our co-specifics. Normativity, materialized in the goals for cognitive actions, is thus seen as a structuring factor of our way of thinking in social life as well. Tomellini and Castelfranchi, 2006. The assumption of normativity in these terms brings benefits not only to the study of the human being and his basic perceptual and conceptual experiences, but also to the social, cultural and institutional realms. Cognitive niches. The history lesson depicted in this lecture is an event occurred in a highly institutionalized environment, the classroom, where we can find very specific social and cognitive practices. As to institutional contexts of learning, it is the most immediate level of analysis of these accomplishments, and is considered here as a cognitive niche. A cognitive niche is a dynamic setting established and associated to the adaptive relationship between people, among other species, and environments. It comes from the idea of ecological niche in evolutionary biology, Cosmides and Tooby, 2000, Clark, 2006, Bardon and Magnani, 2007, and it is related to the dynamics of the adaptation mechanisms developed for living in different environments and habitats. A good definition for niches is given by Sina, 1988, p. 131, and fits perfectly the distributed cognition postulations. A niche is a negotiated, ordered, spatial-temporally structured relationship between organism and habitat, in which behaviors are in part transformative of the environment to which they are adapted. Like any ecological environmental structures constructed by many species, cognitive niches are made for protection and survival, a better perception of the environment, facilitated access to resources and resolution of immediate problems. As a result of the person's action, cognitive niches become meaningful settings wherein people can create tools and techniques, and develop abilities. This perspective brings possibilities to observe the ways in which the capacity of creating and maintaining niches give people the opportunity to develop themselves cognitively and learn, and favor the cultural and material enrichment of social groups. Evidently, the idea that cognitive development and learning presuppose the person integrated to the environment is not new. It can be found for example in Vygotsky's work, Vygotsky, 1987, and substantiates influential theories such as the one presented in Tomasello, 1999. But now the cognitive transformation proposed by these authors can be seen together with the fact that learning can also affect and restructure the environment around the learner. The idea of cognitive niches employed in studies of learning environment presupposes the articulation between concepts originally associated to perceptual mechanisms and theoretical constructs related to conceptualization and learning. This association is possible due to the fact that perception and conceptualization are strictly associated phenomena. Articulating this account to studies on cognition and learning can bring to light several phenomena and also expand our notion about learning, as this action allows us to define with more accuracy what components are desirable and what variables must be observed for a learning task to be accomplished. The definition of the classroom as a cognitive niche, taking into account all the variables delineated above, can help to create for the students an atmosphere auspicious for their success in school, because it opens space for a reliable observation of issues, processes and artifacts associated to learning, and for a specific study of the school environment, which is a setting whose features and behaviors are already known by learners and school agents. These actions take, as a core point, the student's cognition and knowledge as constitutive features of every learning accomplishment. Therefore, if we seek to understand the basis of the cognitive actions of the students, we will be able to perceive, from how they think, who they are, instead of establishing in advance who they will be, and from this prescribe how they learn, a criticism posed by many authors who problematize the institutionalized learning and meaning construction, Walkerdine, 1988, McDermott, 1993, Lave, 1993, Sina, 1999, among many others. In this lecture we are focusing on the cognitive niche as a setting constructed through a dynamics related to the understanding and engagement and interactions wherein intersubjectivity negotiations, normative crossings and possibilities of resemiotization to solve problems of meaning, and recreate meanings as well, are at stake. It can help us assume cognition in a situated becoming, where things constitute an intersubjective flow of negotiation and, resemiotization of the structuring features of our cognitive construals of the world. In the history classroom niche that we are observing, two different events unfolded relatively to the goals of each one, to the learning conditions of each information, and from the establishment of who talks and who listens, since both exercised an agency over the cognitive processes that take place in that setting. In both cases, the niche remained the same as to its basic constraints, but each event made it work under different conditions, which were caused by the change of roles that the contingencies determined. When the teacher was the keynote speaker, the intersubjectivity conditions were defined in advance and not negotiated, rather, they were established in such a way that the students had to strive to transport themselves to the spacetime depicted by her. Their previous knowledge was not accessed, because the teacher did not fulfill the task to bring information and contents of their everyday lives to the semiotic construction in the classroom setting. The result was that there were free associations and a few actions of resemiotization of material and symbolic objects to meet the needs of understanding. The possibilities of learning were not favored. However, when Acerola was the keynote speaker, some differences in the niche were observable. There was more intersubjective negotiation, promoted by the fact that Acerola and his colleagues dealt with the same everyday reality, thus he had the chance to bring and add common knowledge to the semiotic construction in the classroom, and help them understand the contents of the lesson. This could have helped him fulfill his task. As to the intersubjectivity conditions which are specific to the classroom niche, we still need to stress that the possibility of the success of Acerola in interacting with his colleagues because they all bring together the same previous knowledge does not justify the failure of the teacher. On the other hand, having common and shared everyday previous knowledge does not guarantee the teacher's success in promoting learning in the classroom. Rather, one of the fundamental actions for minimal conditions of referential intersubjectivity, Sina and Rodriguez, 2008, is the recognition that the previous knowledge of the learners is a constitutive feature of the didactic practice. This condition allows them to build bridges between what they already know and the new information that the teacher is offering them. This is a basic didactic prescription and keeps its value in all perceptions about cognition and learning, whether or not distributed. The notion of affordance. In the construction and maintenance of cognitive niches, the detection of affordances, Gibson, 1979, Norman, 1988, Jong and Patel, 2000, Hutchby, 2001, Shimero, 2003, Gorniak and Roy 2007, Bardun, 2011, is a result of cognitive actions and emerges from the seek for artifacts available to fulfill specific action goals. They are not previously offered, but specified by the aims and or norms for existing in a given environment. Apart from the discussion about the source of affordances, whether they are detected via direct perception of objects, taking the line of study of Gibson, 1979, or whether they encompass cognitive processing and previous knowledge, according to the alternative proposal of Norman, 1988, if we observe them against the premise of the constitutive relationship between person and environment, we can establish that they are not in things, nor in us. This idea allows us to connect the concepts of affordance and cognitive niche in a distributed cognition perspective. The possibility of recognizing affordances in a specific setting is directly related to the recognition of this setting as a niche. The opposite can also be said, if the person is placed in a given environment and is not willing to recognize affordances, or something else, in that environment because he or she does not have any purposes to be there, it is quite possible that he or she does not recognize that setting as a real cognitive niche. This fact reveals the extent to which what we see is tied by our goals of being there. It is in this sense that we construct cognitively the possibilities of affecting environment and being affected by it. In this perspective, the detection of affordances is an activity that, besides requiring and revealing intelligence, improves procedurally the intelligence of those who detect it. Dennett, 2000, Franks, 2011, because it is a procedure closely connected to the semiotization and resemiotization of things, and is also an action that brings new things into existence. If we take into account that affordances are built under the functionalities and contingencies of cognitive actions in a given niche, we can assert that material artifacts in the classroom can be affordances, to the extent that they are seen as something functionally useful in specific moments. In this sense, their functions can be recreated as this action becomes necessary to solve new problems. So as the map used by the teacher and Acerola. The teacher has used the map in its prototypical function, but Acerola, as he delivered his lesson, he brought into existence a new kind of map, which came from the blending of conflicting dimensions, the Western world of the past, and the Rio de Janeiro of the present. It is not possible not necessary to design and manufacture a specific map which can bring these specific information. But it is possible to conceptually build it through the interaction of the determinant features of Acerola's and the teacher's speeches. He did that this way because the teacher's map did not fit his need to adapt the previous knowledge of the students to the information of the lesson. Affordances and conceptual integration. The cognitive operation which describes the relationship between internal and external domains is called conceptual integration. Fauconnier and Turner, 2002, Sina, 2005, Jong and Patel, 2006, a general process which accounts for phenomena in low and high level cognition, as well as perceptual phenomena. Also known as blending, conceptual integration is the term which gives name to a net of sophisticated processes which subsumes relationships among domains of every kind and the creation of novel artifacts, ideas, techniques, etc. Conceptual integration is also used to describe online construction of meaning in every domain of experience. In the blend, features of these domains are coupled according to the aspects they bring which are relevant for the specific aim of the cognitive processing. There are no constraints for associating these domains and features, but these aspects are detected from the emergence of a generic space which opens the possibility that these features and domains be blended. The effect of the blend, located in the blend space, is the new thing, meaning, representation, concept, affordance and many other accomplishments, which carries features of the inputs but brings traces of its own. Fauconnier and Turner, 2002. The detection of affordances is also in charge of conceptual integration. As elements found in the blend space, affordances can bring features which are unique entities in a unique event of mutual and transforming situated interchange between person and environment. This premise is important for us to detect the sources for the meanings and affordances produced in the niches, and what constitutes them. The basic structural model for conceptual integration is summarized by Fauconnier and Turner, 2002, p. 46, and adapted to the perspective proposed in this lecture. Structural schema of conceptual integration, detection of affordances. The conceptual integration model, blending, associated to affordances is of the double scope kind. Turner, 2008. It occurs when the inputs are formed by different domains. Turner employs the term frames, which do not share the same organizing structure, in the case of affordances, differently structured external and internal domains. The input spaces are filled by, on one side, the internal representations of the person, and, on the other side, the environmental representations. In this operation, the normative component includes the goals of cognitive activity. It embraces the generic space which allows the possibility of articulation between the inputs, and defines some terms and directions of the blending operation. The blending scheme predicts that, although the input spaces can be filled by distinct domains, they can present matched counterparts, indicated by the full line. It also presumes that the formation of new concepts assumes an autonomous nature in relation to the inputs, signaled by the white circles, and admits that the effect of the process can function as input for other blending actuations. These properties turn the blending process into a cognitive processing model which can describe the detection of affordances not as the product of the construction and maintenance of niches, but as a part of the cognitive continuous flow from the bases recognized in this lecture. In sociogenetic terms, they are also a niche structuring component, providing the ratchet effect, which is the improvement of human inventions from generation to generation. Tomasello, 1999. The possibility of describing the emergence of affordances as a blending process brings some advantages which motivate their use as a structural description for many cognitive phenomena, among them the creation of affordances in specific niches. It is a description which explains the relationship person-environment as a genuine cognitive process, since, among other reasons, it can be subsumed under some basic principles of non-autonomous and non-computational cognitive sciences, such as interdominial mapping, Fauconnier, 1997, and online and real-time nature of meaning construction, Coulson, 2001, both of them clearly compatible with the distributed cognition hypothesis. In this sense, it is associated to the cognitive psychology tradition, endorsing and refining classic studies about interactive information processing, McClelland and Rumelhart, 1981. It is a concept identified not only in the flow of the relationship person-environment, but also in the evolution and creation of artifacts, technologies, etc. Fauconnier and Turner, 2002, Sina, 2005. For this reason, it is object of interest in studies in evolutionary anthropology, Mithin, 1999, and developmental psychology, Karmeloff-Smith, 1992, Tomasello, 1999. It is used to explain and describe, in the phylogenesis, the evolutionary gains of Homo sapiens and his/her relationship with the environment, in the ontogenesis, the development of the person, and, in the sociogenesis, learning, in these contexts always keeping the idea that cognition can transform and recreate environments. Last, but not least, it is a model which allows precise identification of the elements directly at issue in the detection of a specific affordance, without losing sight of the other features involved in the process. For this reason, it allows the managing of the context, favoring the work of those who need detailed descriptions of affordances to succeed in their cognitive actions. Mostly, the option for recognizing affordances through describing them via conceptual integration comes from the last item above, because it satisfies the need to systematize the cognitive behaviors which, allied to the socio-cultural experiences proper to the classroom, offer a scenario of the specific conditions of learning settings. Indeed, when we describe the conceptual construction of the map used by Acerola as an affordance to help the students understand events of the past in a context of articulation with their previous knowledge, we can see clearly which features in this formulation were at stake. We can also see how was the image conceived by him from his own conceptualizations about the dimensions included in the process, space, time and territorial definition, to be articulated to the external information given by the teacher's map. Structural schema of conceptual integration, Acerola's map. The map created by Acerola through conceptual integration, which presumes the existence of hills in the 19th century's Western world, could never exist in a supposed exact reality, let alone exist previous to his lesson, because in the 19th century there were not hills conceptualized as countries and occupied by slums. There was not even the concept of slum. As a matter of fact, the map cannot exist outside the events occurred in that niche, and outside the relationships, goals and norms that were regulating the meanings and affordances produced there. What enables the conceptualization of a map which depicts, at the same time, the Western countries and the Rio de Janeiro's hills is a cognitive operation called compression, Fauconnier and Turner, 2002, p. 113. It is related to conceptual integration and refers to information, concepts and dimensions which are selected and adapted to create novel knowledge structures. What we can see now is that the effectiveness of this creation can be better acknowledged when it is observed in a situated fashion, and when the purposes of their existence are taken into concern. In the specific case of Acerola's map, it results from the compression of information associated to the dimension of space. The features of two different places are compressed, and this selective operation captured only information of these places which could not crash during his speech, in order for his colleagues to understand the facts he was portraying. As an affordance, Acerola's map was an object created in a unique and specific niche construction, to suffice his specific task of appropriating the information given by the teacher and deliver them to his colleagues. He built it through the negotiation between the need to reproduce information about history and the will to express himself in order to be heard by the students. And it is quite presumable that he has been successful in this undertaking. Distributed Cognition and School, Environments of Learning. The distributed cognition hypothesis proposes the agency of the environment in meaning construction and the detection of what is meaningful and important for fulfilling action goals in a given setting. These ideas provoke methodological changes in cognitive investigation, Clark and Chalmers, 1998, p. 10, as elicits new and fresh comprehensions about facts and phenomena relating cognitive actions and behaviors, learning, and also memory, language acquisition, beliefs, intersubjectivity, cognitive development, psychomotor abilities. It means that the idea of learning in cognitive niches cannot be the same as the one put by traditional theories of cognition, which usually does not consider the situated identity of the learner in educational contexts. Learning in cognitive niches, as we see, is an agentic, dynamic and creative cognitive action which includes the appropriation of institutional practices, norms, instruments and behaviors, Wirch, 1998, Sawyer and Greeno, 2009. Consequently, in the classroom cognitive niche, with its variety of material and symbolic artifacts, we can expect a set of cognitive behaviors and the emergence of a given kind of affordances which are specific of that niche, and are not found anywhere else, as we could testify in the observation of the history lesson depicted in this lecture. Studies on evolutionary psychology corroborate the idea that the cognitive actions and behaviors identified in the classroom niche can be described as a phylogenetic achievement, due to the developmental psychology supposition for the phylogenetic basis for constructing and understanding cognitive behaviors related to specific settings for pedagogical actions, Premack and Premack, 1996, Shebra and Gergely, 2006. These studies favor the definition of the proper nature of pedagogy and teaching and learning actions as cognitive systems. So all people involved in teaching and learning activities are operating cognitively in a way which is specific for pedagogic purpose, and not for any other one. Assuming these postulations, we advocate that the classroom is a delimited universe where learners, at the same time, are affecting and being affected by its structural organization, which includes the contents to be taught and the material and symbolic artifacts chosen to instrumentalize learning. They construct, act meaningfully, over the symbolic and material artifacts offered by the teacher and the courseware, and turn them into things that they can understand, utilize. In this structured setting, any semiotic object posited as a public use is an object of negotiation, so material and symbolic artifacts are part of the intersubjective negotiation and normative regulations in the classroom. These regulations are institutional. The school as an institution structures the way people cognize in the niche. The process of institutionalization is a specific case of conceptualization of an entity in the world. It establishes a code which specifies how an action in a certain context should be interpreted, or, similarly, establishes the sufficient conditions for the application of institutional concepts, Tumolini and Castelfranchi, 2006. Even in classrooms of different disciplines, their common normative regulations and intersubjectivity conditions lead people to assume functionally similar cognitive behaviors, recognizing themselves as situated subjects, and to tackle with material and symbolic objects in a functionally similar fashion as well. These assumptions, together with the observation of the meaningful acts of Acerola in his role of teacher-learner, bring the importance of taking into account the importance of the students as cognoscent agents in the classroom semiotic construction, as well as the artifacts they interact with. Both need to be framed in the classroom as an institutional space. The quality of joint conceptualization from these artifacts, which includes the way they are seen by teachers and students, is an important variable for achieving the quality of interlocution and learning, ultimately. One of the consequences of this perspective is establishing the student as an agent of his own learning enterprise. Although the asymmetric intersubjectivity condition is one of the classroom institutional patterns, teachers must assist students in the task of turning the classroom environment into a source of affordances. The duty of the one who searches for understanding and creating good learning environments and conditions is to define the basis from which this essential task can be accomplished, and how all important features of teaching and learning must be idealized and situated towards it. About this concern, some initial points are already established. We know that learning occurs with an improvement of our capacity of observing and detecting affordances in the niches where we are settled, relatively to our goals of cognizing. We also know that the previous knowledge of a person is pivotal for him/her to detect affordances. Therefore, the more previous knowledge he or she fits to the niche, the more useful affordances he or she will be able to capture. As a matter of fact, we could see, from the cognitive actions of Acerola, that his previous knowledge and the employment of the knowledge common to all the students in the classroom structured the creation of an affordance which could help him give more understandable information to his colleagues. Therefore, teachers need to help students detect the affordances needed for the activity at issue, having in mind that the ability of perceiving affordances is directly related to the quality of the dynamics in the niche. Franks, 2011, p. 174. They do that by observing, before properly beginning the activity, what the students by themselves recognize as affordances in the classroom setting, and what artifacts and previous knowledge they bring to the classroom. In doing so, teachers will be identifying and eliciting the internal domains of the students which might be blended to the external ones in order for the students to detect all suitable affordances which will help them learning contents in a particular activity. Tomasello, 1999. But teachers can only do this after having established to themselves and to the students the learning goals intended through that activity, and must be sensible to detect whether the students are keeping or not these goals in mind. This is necessary because the learners will only perceive what is important and useful for them to perform a specific activity in a given context if they know what they are performing that activity for. These actions can provide the students with more possibilities to act semiotically over the artifacts, and these behaviors are linked to their stronger singularization in the classroom, and to more possibilities of effective learning. During the years, the recurrence of this kind of action can help learners develop metacognitively. Perfect and Schwartz, 2002, Israel et al., 2005, Waters and Schneider, 2010, or, in other words, to construct their autonomy as learners, from the establishment of their own goals to accomplish a specific activity, and from the conscious employment of the resources for the established aims. But obviously several factors can jeopardize the success in these actions, and they can be related to problems in the detection of affordances in a given environment. Bardun, 2011, presents some of them, showing that these problems can be either in the person, or in the environment. Difficulties in the detection of affordances due to problems of the person are called hidden affordances. They occur, according to Bardun, when the person cannot make use of the signals because either he or she is not enabled to detect affordances, or he or she does not see the clues for recognizing them. Difficulties in the detection of affordances for environmental problems are called failed affordances, and occur when the affordances are badly offered or elaborated, and this impedes their identification. Hidden and failed affordances can occur, at the same time, in some occasions, when the student does not bring to the classroom the previous knowledge enough to be articulated to the goals of action and cognitive behavior specific of the learning task. They also occur when there is ambiguity in the configuration of the available signs, and this problem is not solved by the teacher. It also occurs when there is no clear definition of the goals to undertake a specific task in the classroom, or these goals are not offered as they should be. Moreover, taken the asymmetrical nature of the relationship between students and teacher, the problems in the detection of affordances emerge when the teacher does not establishes himself/herself as the triggerer of the student's learning process, does not elicit the student's previous knowledge, and does not act upon the tasks in the classroom in order to adapt their structure to help the students detect by themselves the affordances as situated guides for learning. That's what happened to Acerola's teacher. She was not sensitive to perceive that her students were not aware of the time and space of the events that she was describing. That's why she heard questions about ancient Romans and modern weapons, but didn't bother of them. The result was that the map that she was using as a possible affordance has failed in its aim to help students construct a conceptual view of past and elsewhere events. Final remarks. At the end of this text it is time to answer the questions we put to ourselves at its beginning. We do assert that Acerola really learned the teacher's lesson, since we established that learning and creating concepts are cognitive operations that blend the material and symbolic objects presented in the environment to the previous knowledge of the learner, and this operation brings new, unique and singular concepts. Notice that Acerola's learning can be attested because his speech selected information with great property. He omitted secondary data about countries and names, but kept the main ideas about the historical moment and motivations for the royal family's journey to Brazil. From what is said above we can say that if he had only repeated the teacher's words, this could not mean learning, because in this situation he would not show precisely the conceptual integration which is the cognitive learning operation par excellence. But we have to stress that the interference of his previous knowledge about social problems in Rio over those historical facts ceases to be part of a learning process and starts to be free interpretation when we cannot identify in his speech the data which came from the objects and ideas found in the environment available as resources for creating new concepts. The map was a didactic artifact for both the teacher and Acerola, but obviously the latter knew how to use it as a real affordance, because he showed that he could clearly understand the task to transport the students to another place in time, and saw the map as a way to go in this journey. This turned the map into something different from a map of Western world and a map of Rio de Janeiro, a map which cannot be taken as real, but it was completely meaningful and did pertain to that special moment they constructed in the classroom. In this lecture we intended to deliver some ideas about learning in institutional environments, from the perspective that human cognition operates and develops itself in a distributed fashion, and within the scope of cognitive niches. Taking this premise into account, discussing how learning occurs in the cognitive niches, and defining the classroom as an essential locus where this operation takes place, means taking into consideration not only the person who learns, but also the relationships between people themselves, and between people and context. The best advantage that this perspective can bring lies in the epigraph of this text: the more we search to understand what cognition is, in real context of cognitive action, and the more we incorporate to cognitive science the evidence that our relationship with the world is interchanged with our ways of thinking, the closer we find ourselves to understand who we are, ultimately. And, doing so, we will be able to effectively help the students who present learning problems, which in the past were considered as their problems, but now are seen as an outcome of how the school is being constituted as a niche and as an institution, relatively to the aims it is created for. These possibilities bring the task to improve didactic practices and pedagogic projects not only from a better understanding about learning as a cognitive accomplishment, but also from comprehending how it is possible to construct a better institutional structure for this aim. To face this challenge, the body of research in cognitive science, especially in distributed cognition, can bring resources for a wide and necessary institutional discussion about learning processes. And the assumption of the classroom as a cognitive niche can materialize the necessary interchange between cognitive and social sciences, because its complete comprehension demands the articulation of cognitive and cultural systems. However, we must say that the non-autonomist and non-essentialist perspective of cognition, in which we are inscribed, is not turned to define a priori how people cognize in a given context. But the fact that the classroom is a normatized space, i.e., a space regulated by social and cultural constraints, elicits an attempt to establish some parameters of the way the students deal with symbolic and material artifacts, and deliver possible understandings about the intersubjective structures that can be found in the classroom. Keeping these purposes in mind, the studies on distributed cognition can ally to other achievements which have pointed to the need to problematize school as an institution, its alleged aims and the historical and ideological basis upon which it is funded, in order to provide the students with a better quality of work and learning, during the time that they are there. Introduction. Understanding refers to the ability to understand, which means to comprehend, to apprehend the meaning or import of, or to grasp the idea of. Oxford English Dictionary, 1989. Understanding is a key concept within all fields of study concerning learning and development, such as cognitive psychology, pedagogy, educational sciences, and developmental psychology. Within these fields of study, understanding has been studied for different domains, such as scientific reasoning, for example, Grotzer, 2004, In Helder and Piaget, 1958-2001, Rapalt-Schlickman, Tenenbaum, Koki, and Fisher, 2007, Social Development, for example, Blige Haguis, 2008, Mathematics, for example, Dane, 1997, Gilmore and Bryant, 2008, and many more. In the field of education, children's understanding is especially important, as understanding involves deep knowledge of concepts, and the active manipulation of this knowledge in the form of explaining, predicting, applying, and generalizing. Perkins and Blythe, 1994. A model of understanding can give guidance to both researchers and educators dealing with children's understanding and the development of their understanding. In this lecture, we will present such a model, based on dynamic systems and skill theory principles. The model is illustrated throughout this lecture with examples of children's understanding of scientific concepts, or more specifically, children's understanding of airflow and air pressure during a syringe task, which is described below. The syringe's task is designed to let children explore how air flows through a system, and to introduce them to the relationship between pressure and volume, as well as the way in which pressure can exert forces on objects. See also de Berg, 1995. Although there are some basic questions the researcher asks every child during the administration of the task, most of the interaction between the boy and the researcher emerges in real time, i.e. during the task itself. Between 3 and 7 years of age, important changes in children's conceptual understanding of scientific concepts take place. Van Hert and Steenbeek, 2008, in addition to changes in curiosity and exploration tendencies. Simonton, 1999, which are probably related to important changes in children's lives. That is, they go through a major transition when they enter first grade, and start learning to read, write, and to do arithmetic. Carriere, 2009. During this age period children's learning behavior gets shape, attitudes toward school are formed, and first interactions with peers and teachers in a school setting emerge, which are the building blocks of academic performance at a later age. Moreover, this is also the age at which important cognitive developmental transitions take place. From the work of Piaget, 1947-2001, we know that children between 3 and 7 years old are in the pre-operational stage of development, which is characterized by the forming of concepts, and the use of symbols to think about the world, but also by centrism, i.e., focusing on a single aspect instead of more aspects while children reason or solve problems. More recently, research using skill theory, which is inspired by Piaget's theory, illustrated that the highest skill, understanding, level that children first reach between 3 and 7 years of age develops from single representations, understandings that go beyond specific actions on objects, to representational systems, linking several of these representations that define the object or concept at hand. See also Section 3, Fisher and Beidel, 2006. However, this research also showed that children vary enormously in their skills across context, tasks, and within short periods of time. This variation is due to the fact that context dynamically contributes to the deployment of skills in the form of a real-time activity. That is, thinking or understanding takes place in the form of action. How does the process of understanding occur in action, taking into account the real-time interactions that constitute this process in a teaching environment, and taking into account the vast amount of intra-individual variability? Based on our ongoing longitudinal research project, we will illustrate how short-term building blocks of understanding give rise to various long-term patterns of understanding. In order to fully understand these short-term building blocks, we have selected one particular problem domain for this lecture, namely airflow and air pressure, because it provides a domain that is both limited and rich enough to study. Zooming in on these short-term interactive processes gives us important information to understand the development and transformations of understanding on the long term. Steenbeek, 2006, Thalen and Smith, 1994. During the ongoing longitudinal research project, a researcher repeatedly visits 32 young children, 3 to 6 years old, as part of an ongoing longitudinal study on children's understanding of scientific concepts, such as the flow of air and air pressure. During one visit, the researcher presents each child with 2 empty medical syringes without a needle, which are joined together by a small transparent tube. One of the syringe's pistons is pulled out. "What do you think will happen if I push this in?" is one of the questions the researcher asks. This question triggers a variety of answers from the children. Some children think nothing happens, others say the tube will pop out, whereas others even think the material will explode. Some children say they don't know and others predict that the piston of the other syringe comes out, which is the right answer in this case. After the researcher demonstrates what happens, researcher and child discuss about possible explanations for this phenomenon. Again, multiple answers are given. Some children simply say they don't know. A few mention batteries or electricity as a causal explanation, whereas others say that water flows through the syringes and causes the piston to move upwards. Some children emphasize the tube that connects the syringes, and others understand that air flows through the tube and syringes. What accounts for the differences in young children's understanding of scientific concepts, and what is the role of the environment, i.e., the teacher in supporting and promoting this understanding? To answer this question, a model of children's scientific understanding should take the complexity and dynamic nature of this into account, as well as the complex interactions with the environment on which the understanding of children is often based. Fisher and Beidel, 2006. This lecture aims at explaining how children's understanding of scientific concepts can be studied using a model based on properties derived from dynamic systems theory, for example Van Hert, 1994, and skill theory, Fisher, 1980, Fisher and Beidel, 2006. Dynamic systems and understanding. A dynamic systems approach describes how one condition changes into another, and how different timescales are interrelated. Van Hert, 1994, Van Hert, 1998, Van Hert and Steenbeek, 2005, 2008, see also the theory of embedded embodied cognition of Thalen and Smith, 1994. Research in the dynamic systems paradigm investigates real-time processes and captures development as it unfolds through multiple interactions between a child and the environment. Van Hert and Fisher, 2009. Such development can be viewed as a self-organizing process, since the state of the system organizes from the multiple interactions among the elements, for example the child and environment. Over time, the system state may emerge towards certain stable states, or attractors, for example, Thalen and Smith, 1994. Dynamic systems theory has so far proven to be a valuable framework for studying human development, including reflexes, Smith and Thalen, 2003, parent-child interactions, Fogel and Garvey, 2007, language development, Van Dijk and Van Hert, 2007, scaffolding and teaching learning situations, Van Hert and Steenbeek, 2005, dyadic play interactions, Steenbeek, 2006, identity development, like Schwark-Askoff, Van Hert, Bosma, and Kunin, 2008, and cognitive development, Fisher, 1980, Fisher and Beidel, 2006. The approach makes use of methods to investigate time serial processes, and test dynamical relations between these processes. Cheshire, Muldoon, Francis, Lewis, and Ball, 2007, like Schwark-Askoff, et al., 2008, Van Hert and Steenbeek, 2005, 2007, Steenbeek and Van Hert, 2005. For example, Van Geertan Steenbeek 2005, 2007, present mathematical models to predict patterns and variations in combinations of variables over time. Other authors use time series to describe relationships between variables, Van Dijk and Van Hert, 2007, or state space grids, Hollenstein, 2007, to investigate interactions between dyads, as opposed to probabilistic approaches which rely on deviations from the mean and group differences. Applying a dynamic approach to the study of understanding scientific concepts means that several properties of this approach have to be taken into account. Below, 4 properties: intertwining person-context dynamics, iterativeness, interconnected time scales, and microgenetical variability. Actually, the dynamic systems approach has many more properties or tools, Howe and Lewis, 2005, to study development. However, we highlighted these 4 specific properties to illustrate how this approach sheds new light on the study of understanding scientific concepts. And examples of their application to the study of understanding, for example, scientific concepts, will be discussed. In Section 5, the properties will be illustrated in light of an empirical example, in combination with skill theory's framework to measure the complexity level of understanding, Fisher and Rose, 1999. Actually, the dynamic systems approach has many more properties or tools, Howe and Lewis, 2005, to study development. However, we highlighted these 4 specific properties to illustrate how this approach sheds new light on the study of understanding scientific concepts. Vygotsky, 1934-1986, already pointed out that children develop understanding in close cooperation with their teachers and the material. His concept of the zone of proximal development is a dynamically changing concept, in which teacher and child co-construct the child's development. This means that the child's skills and understanding are constructed by a series of actions guided by the educator, instructions and tool use, which are then internalized and personalized, cf. Van Hert, 1998, Van Hert and Steenbeek, 2005. From a dynamic systems perspective, understanding is seen as a process of intertwining person-context dynamics, Thalen and Smith, 1994, meaning that the social, for example, the science teacher, and material environment, for example, materials used in science class, play an active part in the process and cannot be viewed separately, or merely as an outside-based influence. In fact, these elements are intertwined across time, in a continuous person-environment loop. At any moment in time, one component, for example, the child, affects the other, for example, the teacher, and the other affects the first, thus creating the conditions under which both components will operate during the next moment in time, Steenbeek, 2006. For example, interactions between a child, a researcher, and the syringe's task will organize towards certain distributed patterns of understanding at that moment, in real time, which eventually evolve towards stable attractors on a longer time scale, Thalen, 1989, Halley and Winkler, 2008. Hence, understanding is an active process of what the child constructs in interaction with, not just within, a specific environment, in which each individual contribution is virtually meaningless if not viewed in light of the interaction, Van Hert and Fisher, 2009. Merged together, person and context become what Fogel and Garvey, 2007, call a cooperative unit, in which both components not only contribute to the process of development, but are highly intertwined and form a unique process together. Representationalists, such as Fodor, 1981, hold the idea that understanding takes the form of internal structures, representations, within the child's mind. A child's scientific understanding thus consists of a collection of these internal structures which represent scientific facts and concepts, which are activated and used to coordinate our behavior toward the current environment, Hasselager, de Groot, and Van Rippard, 2003. In this case, a concept or representing model of the air pressure task would be represented in the child's mind, and this representation would guide the child's behavior as he or she is working on the actual air pressure task. Terms such as concept or representation are actually more or less undefined, and derive their meaning from a particular theoretical framework. From a representationalist, or information processing, view, these words refer to internal entities responsible for our thinking or actions toward the environment. From a dynamic view, however, these words refer to processes, perception and action structures, that emerge within a specific environment, Van Hert and Fisher, 2009. Perceiving, acting and thinking are conscious processes that take a particular shape in the stream of consciousness of the participants, such as a child and the researcher, Van Gelder, 1995, 1998. This shape is governed by the participants' actions on the objects, such as the syringes, or on physical representations of the syringes, such as prints or drawings, within their current context, and should not be identified with a retrieval of internally stored representations, Van Hert, 2011. We can construct much of this stream of consciousness by carefully watching the ongoing interaction between child and environment in terms of the intertwining of various forms of verbal and nonverbal behavior, such as eye and head movements, gestures, pointing, verbal descriptions, manipulations of the materials, etc. The child's current understanding of the concept at issue, for instance, the flow of air through two syringes connected by a tube, is the child's continuously changing state of mind, or stream of consciousness, as he picks up and reacts to whatever goes on in the current dynamic interaction. Thus, despite the fact that the process of constructing an understanding is a distributed process, involving the intertwining of person and context, understanding can still be specified as an individual and internal process corresponding with the individual child's ongoing state of mind, but only as a changing state that unfolds in this active process. Van Hert, 2011. Hence, representations are structures that emerge during a specific interaction in a specific environment, and are not internal symbolic structures which guide behavior. Within the process that results from an intertwining between person and context, understanding emerges through iteration, that is, every step in understanding is based on the previous one and embedded in the current context. More precisely, iterativeness, sometimes referred to as recursiveness, involves a series of computational operations, in which the input of the next operation is the output of the previous one. For instance, if a child determines that an empty syringe contains air, he can build on this knowledge by trying out what happens if he joins two of these syringes together by using a tube. Understanding changes through repeated interactions, instead of being the retrieval of a complete representation that is already there in memory. During a teaching interaction, each previous action of the child has an influence on the subsequent reaction. In other words, the existing understanding is the basis for the emergence of the next understanding as it develops in the interaction. In its simplest possible form, a dynamic systems model specifies the change in a variable, L, over time, T, as a function of the current level of the variable, Lt plus 1 equals F lieutenant. The function refers here to the change in understanding, but can specify any sort of influence or mechanism of change. Steenbeek, 2006. Understanding does not consist of particular moments within the interaction, for example when the child answers, but is in fact the whole iterative process itself, and every interaction unit is a component of this holistic understanding process during a particular problem-solving event. Even though understanding consists of the whole iterative process, the child's answers are a reflection of the child's ongoing state of mind within that process and reveal his or her understanding at that very moment in time. As Howe and Lewis, 2005, point out, the iterative nature of the process of understanding can also explain some of the differences between children. When children's understanding depends on interactions, and each interaction is based on the previous one, small differences between children's initial states of understanding can grow bigger over several interactions. This is particularly so if the process takes the form of a positive feedback loop amplifying idiosyncratic properties of the answers, i.e. properties that are typical of a particular child. For example, if the child focuses on only one syringe and the researcher's follow-up questions center on that syringe as well, the difference between this child and another child who focuses on both syringes grows bigger. However, if the process takes the form of a negative feedback loop reducing the idiosyncrasies, small differences in initial states will most likely remain small over the course of the problem-solving process. This would be the case if the researcher switches the focus of her follow-up questions to the other syringe, thereby scaffolding the child towards a more complete picture of the task. The difference between this child and the child who initially focused on two syringes then becomes smaller. The property of interconnected timescales entails that the dynamics of long-term development of understanding are intrinsically related to the dynamics of short-term processes of understanding. Phelan and Smith, 1994, Lewis, 2000. That is, in order to get a grip on long-term changes in understanding of children, it is worthwhile to focus on the short-term, microgenetic, process, and examine properties of that process, such as variability. Granite, Fisher, and Parziali, 2002, Steenbeek, 2006. Iterativeness occurs on the short term as well as on the long term, meaning that on the short term, for example during one interaction between child and teacher in science class, each step in understanding is based on the previous step in understanding, while on the long term each interaction builds on the preceding interaction, for example the interaction during last week's science class. In this way, the same mechanisms are sculpting the development of understanding over a shorter and longer period. Phelan and Corbetta, 2002, indicate that the general principles underlying behavioral change work at multiple time scales. The short and long-term scales interact, in that repeated, iterative, processes on the short-term time scale influence processes on the long-term time scale. Lewis, 2000. In addition, the emergence of large-scale patterns also influences what happens on the short-term time scale, by shaping the structure and function of the interaction on the short term. Lewis and Granick, 2000, Smith and Phelan, 2003, Van Hert and Steenbeek, 2005, Steenbeek, 2006. The underlying idea is that all levels of the developing system interact with each other in a self-organizing way, and consist of nested processes that unfold over many time scales, from milliseconds to years. Thalen and Smith, 1994, Lewis, 2000. As a result of the iterative organization of the components and the intertwining between child and context that mark the process of children's understanding, we can observe microgenetical variability. This means that the complexity of children's understanding fluctuates within very short periods of time, for example during one task. While studying the processes of developmental change, it is crucial to take many observations, adopting a microgenetic research method, to detect the subtle changes that constitute understanding and its development. Siegler and Crowley, 1991, Kuhn, 1995. Researchers note that, driven by bidirectional interactions with the environment, the complexity of children's understanding can increase during a task, but also temporarily decrease, for example when the task difficulty increases, when the teacher's support decreases, or when children encounter something unexpected while working on a task. Understanding can change gradually or abruptly in a stage-like pattern in a short time frame, even during a single task. Yan and Fisher, 2007, Siegler and Crowley, 1991. Researchers have suggested that this variation is an important factor in development, since an increase in variability may be related to the ability to reach higher levels of skill. Howe and Lewis, 2005, Thalen, 1989, or, more generally, to a transition to another pattern of behavior, i.e., attractor, for example, Thalen and Smith, 1994, Van Hert, 1994. The variability on the short term, for example during the syringes task or during a science lesson, can therefore yield important information about how the developmental pathways of understanding will be shaped on the long term. In order to capture the complexity of understanding and variations in complexity over a short and longer time periods, we can use skill theory's framework of cognitive development. Fisher, 1980, Fisher and Beidel, 2006. This framework can be used on both the long and short-term time scale and is compatible with a dynamic systems approach. Even more so, skill theory could be considered as a specific dynamic systems theory applied to human skill development, since it assumes skills are built in an iterative and hierarchical way, i.e. each skill level builds on the previously obtained skill level. Moreover, skills are highly context dependent and fluctuate over time, that is, they depend on the constraints and affordances of the context in which they are mastered. Fisher and Beidel, 2006. Intertwining person-context dynamics. Vygotsky, 1934-1986, already pointed out that children develop understanding in close cooperation with their teachers and the material. His concept of the zone of proximal development is a dynamically changing concept, in which teacher and child co-construct the child's development. This means that the child's skills and understanding are constructed by a series of actions guided by the educator, instructions and tool use, which are then internalized and personalized. Cf. Van Hert, 1998, Van Hert and Steenbeek, 2005. From a dynamic systems perspective, understanding is seen as a process of intertwining person-context dynamics. Thalen and Smith, 1994, meaning that the social, for example, the science teacher, and material environment, for example, materials used in science class, play an active part in the process and cannot be viewed separately, or merely as an outside-based influence. In fact, these elements are intertwined across time, in a continuous person-environment loop. At any moment in time, one component, for example, the child, affects the other, for example, the teacher, and the other affects the first, thus creating the conditions under which both components will operate during the next moment in time. Steenbeek, 2006. For example, interactions between a child, a researcher, and the syringes task will organize towards certain distributed patterns of understanding at that moment, in real time, which eventually evolve towards stable attractors on a longer time scale. Thalen, 1989, Halley and Winkler, 2008. Hence, understanding is an active process of what the child constructs in interaction with, not just within, a specific environment, in which each individual contribution is virtually meaningless if not viewed in light of the interaction. Van Hert and Fisher, 2009. Merged together, person and context become what Fogel and Garvey, 2007, call a cooperative unit. in which both components not only contribute to the process of development, but are highly intertwined and form a unique process together. Representationalists, such as Fodor, 1981, hold the idea that understanding takes the form of internal structures, representations, within the child's mind. A child's scientific understanding thus consists of a collection of these internal structures which represent scientific facts and concepts, which are activated and used to coordinate our behavior toward the current environment. Hasselager, de Groot, and Van Rippard, 2003. In this case, a concept or representing model of the air pressure task would be represented in the child's mind, and this representation would guide the child's behavior as he or she is working on the actual air pressure task. Terms such as concept or representation are actually more or less undefined, and derive their meaning from a particular theoretical framework. From a representationalist, or information processing, view, these words refer to internal entities responsible for our thinking or actions toward the environment. From a dynamic view, however, these words refer to processes, perception and action structures, that emerge within a specific environment. Van Hert and Fisher, 2009. Perceiving, acting and thinking are conscious processes that take a particular shape in the stream of consciousness of the participants, such as a child and the researcher. Van Gelder, 1995, 1998. This shape is governed by the participants' actions on the objects, such as the syringes, or on physical representations of the syringes, such as prints or drawings, within their current context, and should not be identified with a retrieval of internally stored representations. Van Hert, 2011. We can construct much of this stream of consciousness by carefully watching the ongoing interaction between child and environment in terms of the intertwining of various forms of verbal and nonverbal behavior, such as eye and head movements, gestures, pointing, verbal descriptions, manipulations of the materials, etc. The child's current understanding of the concept at issue, for instance, the flow of air through two syringes connected by a tube, is the child's continuously changing state of mind, or stream of consciousness, as he picks up and reacts to whatever goes on in the current dynamic interaction. Thus, despite the fact that the process of constructing an understanding is a distributed process, involving the intertwining of person and context, understanding can still be specified as an individual and internal process corresponding with the individual child's ongoing state of mind, but only as a changing state that unfolds in this active process. Van Hert, 2011. Hence, representations are structures that emerge during a specific interaction in a specific environment, and are not internal symbolic structures which guide behavior. Iterativeness. Within the process that results from an intertwining between person and context, understanding emerges through iteration, that is, every step in understanding is based on the previous one and embedded in the current context. More precisely, iterativeness, sometimes referred to as recursiveness, involves a series of computational operations, in which the input of the next operation is the output of the previous one. For instance, if a child determines that an empty syringe contains air, he can build on this knowledge by trying out what happens if he joins two of these syringes together by using a tube. Understanding changes through repeated interactions, instead of being the retrieval of a complete representation that is already there in memory. During a teaching interaction, each previous action of the child has an influence on the subsequent reaction. In other words, the existing understanding is the basis for the emergence of the next understanding as it develops in the interaction. In its simplest possible form, a dynamic systems model specifies the change in a variable, L, over time, T, as a function of the current level of the variable, Lt plus 1 equals F lieutenant. The function refers here to the change in understanding, but can specify any sort of influence or mechanism of change. Steenbeek, 2006. Understanding does not consist of particular moments within the interaction, for example when the child answers, but is in fact the whole iterative process itself, and every interaction unit is a component of this holistic understanding process during a particular problem-solving event. Even though understanding consists of the whole iterative process, the child's answers are a reflection of the child's ongoing state of mind within that process and reveal his or her understanding at that very moment in time. As Howe and Lewis, 2005, point out, the iterative nature of the process of understanding can also explain some of the differences between children. When children's understanding depends on interactions, and each interaction is based on the previous one, small differences between children's initial states of understanding can grow bigger over several interactions. This is particularly so if the process takes the form of a positive feedback loop amplifying idiosyncratic properties of the answers, i.e. properties that are typical of a particular child. For example, if the child focuses on only one syringe and the researcher's follow-up questions center on that syringe as well, the difference between this child and another child who focuses on both syringes grows bigger. However, if the process takes the form of a negative feedback loop reducing the idiosyncrasies, small differences in initial states will most likely remain small over the course of the problem-solving process. This would be the case if the researcher switches the focus of her follow-up questions to the other syringe, thereby scaffolding the child towards a more complete picture of the task. The difference between this child and the child who initially focused on two syringes then becomes smaller. Timescales. The property of interconnected timescales entails that the dynamics of long-term development of understanding are intrinsically related to the dynamics of short-term processes of understanding. Thalen and Smith, 1994, Lewis, 2000. That is, in order to get a grip on long-term changes in understanding of children, it is worthwhile to focus on the short-term, microgenetic, process, and examine properties of that process, such as variability. Granite, Fisher, and Parziali, 2002, Steenbeek, 2006. Iterativeness occurs on the short term as well as on the long term, meaning that on the short term, for example during one interaction between child and teacher in science class, each step in understanding is based on the previous step in understanding, while on the long term each interaction builds on the preceding interaction, for example the interaction during last week's science class. In this way, the same mechanisms are sculpting the development of understanding over a shorter and longer period. Thalen and Corbetta, 2002, indicate that the general principles underlying behavioral change work at multiple time scales. The short and long-term scales interact, in that repeated, iterative, processes on the short-term time scale influence processes on the long-term time scale. Lewis, 2000. In addition, the emergence of large-scale patterns also influences what happens on the short-term time scale, by shaping the structure and function of the interaction on the short term. Lewis and Granick, 2000, Smith and Thalen, 2003, Van Hert and Steenbeek, 2005, Steenbeek, 2006. The underlying idea is that all levels of the developing system interact with each other in a self-organizing way, and consist of nested processes that unfold over many time scales, from milliseconds to years. Thalen and Smith, 1994, Lewis, 2000. Microgenetical variability. As a result of the iterative organization of the components and the intertwining between child and context that mark the process of children's understanding, we can observe microgenetical variability. This means that the complexity of children's understanding fluctuates within very short periods of time, for example during one task. While studying the processes of developmental change, it is crucial to take many observations, adopting a microgenetic research method, to detect the subtle changes that constitute understanding and its development. Siegler and Crowley, 1991, Kuhn, 1995. Researchers note that, driven by bidirectional interactions with the environment, the complexity of children's understanding can increase during a task, but also temporally decrease, for example when the task difficulty increases, when the teacher support decreases, or when children encounter something unexpected while working on a task. Understanding can change gradually or abruptly in a stage-like pattern in a short time frame, even during a single task. Yan and Fisher, 2007, Siegler and Crowley, 1991. Researchers have suggested that this variation is an important factor in development, since an increase in variability may be related to the ability to reach higher levels of skill. Howe and Lewis, 2005, Thalen, 1989, or, more generally, to a transition to another pattern of behavior, i.e., attractor. For example, Thalen and Smith, 1994, Van Hert, 1994. The variability on the short term, for example during the syringes task or during a science lesson, can therefore yield important information about how the developmental pathways of understanding will be shaped on the long term. In order to capture the complexity of understanding and variations in complexity over a short and longer time periods, we can use skill theory's framework of cognitive development. Fisher, 1980, Fisher and Beidel, 2006. This framework can be used on both the long and short-term time scale and is compatible with a dynamic systems approach. Even more so, skill theory could be considered as a specific dynamic systems theory applied to human skill development, since it assumes skills are built in an iterative and hierarchical way, i.e. each skill level builds on the previously obtained skill level. Moreover, skills are highly context dependent and fluctuate over time, that is, they depend on the constraints and affordances of the context in which they are mastered. Fisher and Beidel, 2006. Skill Theory and Understanding. Skill theory focuses on the complexity and variability of children's skills, which consist of actions and thinking abilities, and the way these are constructed. Fisher, 1980, Fisher and Beidel, 2006. Since skills are thinking structures mastered in a specific context, such as a science class, they hold both person-related as well as context-related characteristics. Parziali and Fisher, 1998. An example of a skill is a child's ability to understand how air pressure works while manipulating the syringe's task. This understanding is reformulated when the student works on a similar task in another environment, for example with different materials or without the help of the researcher. Skills are thus highly influenced by the possibilities and constraints of the situation in which the skill is used. Skill theory explains both long and short-term development of skills by measuring these on the same hierarchical complexity scale. This complexity scale consists of 10 levels, grouped into 3 tiers, which are sensory-motor, representational or abstract by nature. The scale can be applied to different cognitive, Fisher and Granite, 1995, Schwartz and Fisher, 2005, social, Fisher and Beidel, 2006, and language domains, Fisher and Corrigan, 1981, as it focuses on hierarchical complexity rather than content. This makes skill theory especially suitable to describe differences between children, as well as differences between skills in different domains for the same child. Parziali and Fisher, 1998. A child's understanding within a domain, as an emergent process in real time, can be viewed along 2 dimensions, the first being the dimension of content, the subject, the second of complexity, the complicatedness. In order to evaluate children's understanding of, for example, air pressure, we need a fair ruler to determine how elaborate their understanding is, and to evaluate whether they need extra help in some areas. One of the most powerful characteristics of skill theory, Fisher, 1980, is that it extracts complexity from content, resulting in a content-independent ruler of understanding. Because of the content-independent nature of the way skill theory approaches understanding, or other skills, it enables researchers to compare understanding across multiple time points, contexts, persons, and for different age ranges. According to Fisher, 1980, and Fisher and Beidel, 2006, development in a particular domain goes through 10 levels of skills hierarchically grouped into 3 tiers that develop between 3 months and adulthood. The first tier consists of sensory-motor skills, simple connections of perceptions to actions or utterances. An example is a statement that 2 syringes are attached to a tube. Sensory-motor skills form the basis of the skills in the 2 subsequent tiers, i.e. they are the building blocks of the higher levels. The second tier constitutes of representational skills. These are understandings that go beyond current simple perception-action couplings, but are still based on them. Hence, the term representation refers to the coordination of several sensory-motor skills at the same time, not to an internal symbolic structure. Fisher, 1980. Within the context of the air pressure task, for example, the child can predict what will happen if the piston is pushed in without literally touching or manipulating the syringe. Nonetheless, what he or she predicts depends on the material context, and on the sensory-motor skills that he or she mastered before. The third tier consists of abstractions, which are general non-concrete rules that also apply in other situations. Schwartz and Fisher, 2005. This would be an explanation about the relationship between pressure and volume inside a syringe. Within each tier, 3 levels can be distinguished. After the 3 levels of the abstraction tier, a higher complexity level emerges, also known as single principles, which is the 10th level of the scale. Additionally, people function on the few highest levels usually in early adulthood, but only for their domains of expertise. For most other domains, people function on a lower complexity level, each one more complex than the previous one. The first one can be characterized as a single set, meaning a single action, or a single representation, or a single abstraction. The second level is a relation between two of these sets, which is referred to as a mapping. The third level is a system of sets, which is a relation between two mappings, in which each mapping consists of a relation between single sets. After this level, a new tier starts, which is divided in single sets, mappings and systems as well. Fisher and Beidel, 2006. For the emergence of each level, evidence of discontinuities and differences between levels has been demonstrated using analysis methods based on Rothschild, Schwartz and Fisher, 2005. After the three levels of the abstraction tier, a higher complexity level emerges, also known as single principles, which is the 10th level of the scale. Additionally, people function on the few highest levels usually in early adulthood, but only for their domains of expertise. For most other domains, people function on a lower complexity level. Fisher and colleagues, Fisher, 1980, Fisher and Beidel, 2006, Yen and Fisher, 2002, Schwartz and Fisher, 2005, Granit and Parziali, 2002, showed that skill theory can not only describe and explain the development of skills on the long term, but also describe the microgenesis of problem solving. When facing a new task or problem within a domain, even high-skilled adults go through the same cycles of development. That is, at the beginning they show skill levels that are mostly sensory-motor, which build up to more elaborate levels during the course of the task. During a task, and also during the long-term development of skills, people do not go through the skill cycles in a linear fashion. Instead, they repeatedly build up skill levels and show collapse before they obtain their highest possible level, something Yan and Fisher, 2002, call scalloping. During a task, people vary constantly within a bandwidth between their highest and lowest possible complexity levels, which is also known as the developmental range. The highest levels within the bandwidth are only reachable when the environment provides sufficient support. Fisher and Beidel, 2006, see also Yan and Fisher, 2002. Skill theory also accounts for inter-individual differences in understanding and is therefore especially suitable for describing individual developmental pathways. Fisher, Rose, and Rose, 2007. Yan and Fisher, 2002, showed that adults' performance on a computer task can move through a variety of pathways, each one showing nonlinear fluctuations. Of all participants, novices showed the most frequent and rapid fluctuations in performance. Experts however fluctuated less frequent in their performance, meaning that variations followed on each other in a slower fashion. In sum, a model of understanding needs some kind of ruler to determine the complexity of understanding levels children show. Skill theory, Fisher, 1980, Fisher and Beidel, 2006, provides a content-independent ruler for understanding, which can be applied to different timescales of development, and takes both the role of context, as well as inter- and intra-individual variability into account. A model of understanding. Using the four properties from the dynamic systems paradigm and skill theory's ruler, we can construct a model of understanding to guide research and practice in education, but also in other areas that require the evaluation of cognitive growth. The general model of understanding here is that it is an active process, distributed across people involved, and that it is dynamic, i.e., it continuously changes, and self-organizes through iteration. It is important to keep in mind that, even though the four properties describe distinct mechanisms, they all work at the same time while the process of understanding unfolds. Below, we will present the model and briefly highlight its components, after which we discuss these in more detail by using an empirical example. As shows, children construct levels of understanding during short-term interactions with the environment, such as during a task they are working on together with an adult. Both child and adult are characterized by specific distal factors, for example years of schooling, that influence their behavior. However, those distal factors are not what we focus on, since the figure can be characterized as an action model, that is, it focuses on understandings which are constructed during an interaction by means of a process that is distributed across the child, the adult, and the material context with which they interact or which they manipulate. This means that during an interaction, there is a bidirectional influence between the child's answers and the adult's questions within the material context. This is illustrated in the big square, Part A, of Figure 1. Moreover, the process is iterative, meaning that it changes through repeated interactions, instead of being the retrieval of a complete representation that is already there in memory. During a teaching interaction, each previous action of the child has an influence once subsequent reaction. This is illustrated by the big arrows between adult and child, part B of figure 1, and the small arrows on the side of the boxes indicating the child and adult. Each task-related utterance has two dimensions, a specific content and a complexity level. During interactions, we can observe the complexity level of understanding, as it comes forward in the child's distinct utterances, which are often reactions to what the adult is saying, or are part of the ongoing discussion between an adult and a child. This complexity level, measured by skill theory, Fisher, 1980, will vary between different children, and will fluctuate over time within the same child. This is illustrated by part C in figure 1. Lastly, the long-term development of children's understanding unfolds through several of these short-term interactions. As an example, figure 1 displays the sessions with 3-month intervals we used in our study of young children's understanding of scientific concepts. The link between short and long-term development is indicated in part D of figure 1, an empirical example and illustration of the model. In the next sections, we illustrate the model and the 4 properties by using an example, see Table 1, derived from our empirical study focusing on the long-term development of understanding air pressure, and other scientific concepts, such as gravity, in 3 to 7-year-old children. Table 1 is an excerpt of a transcribed session in which a boy, 4 years, 6 months, and a researcher explore the syringes task mentioned in the introduction. The transcript starts right after the point in which the researcher and the boy explored the exterior of the syringes. That is, they compared them in size and examined the numbers written on the outside. Excerpt of a session from our longitudinal project in which a boy, 4 years, 6 months, explores the syringes task together with a researcher. An important part of these context dynamics is the social part of the context, meaning the people around the child. Thus, the development of the child's understanding occurs in interaction with the social environment, for example the teacher, and it is this interaction that drives the process of understanding, enabling the student to receive adaptive assistance and make progress step by step. Hirsch-Pasek, Volenkoff, Burke, and Singer, 2009, Van Hert and Steenbeek, 2005. In our example, see Table 1, the child constructs his answers together with the researcher. The researcher's questions are guided by, and on their turn guide, the child's answers. An illustration of this can be seen in fragments 2 to 6 of Table 1. After the boy answers he does not know what happens with the syringe he is holding if the researcher pushes the piston of the other one in, the researcher asks him, "What do you think?" In this way, she is trying to get the boy to make predictions, encouraging him to hypothesize. In response, the boy looks around and does not answer the question. The researcher, in turn, helps him getting started by summarizing what he said before and by a verbal repetition of her actions with a task material. After having heard the adult's repetition of her actions, the boy starts to construct an answer on a higher complexity level than before. In terms of skill theory, this answer can be classified as a single representation, as he makes a prediction that goes beyond simpler perception-action couplings. Skill levels, when applicable, are indicated the right column of Table 1. 2 things are important here. First, the researcher is responding to the boy in this way, because he did not know the answer. Had the boy given the answer, she may have pushed the piston in, or asked him to elaborate on his answer. Because the boy does not know the answer, she needs an approach to determine whether he really has no idea, and if so, how she can help him to make a prediction based on what he knows about the syringes. In order to do this, she tries out 2 different approaches. First, she asks him what he thinks, which can be a starting point for further elaboration on his side. When the boy does not reply, she decides to help him to get started by giving some information about what they have done and seen before. The boy now hypothesizes what happens if the piston of one of the syringes is pushed in. The answer to the question "What do you think will happen?" See Fragment 1 of Table 1, is therefore the product of the interaction between the boy and researcher. In her reactions to the boy's "I don't know," the researcher is trying to guide his understanding. In turn, after hearing the researcher's summary, the boy constructs his understanding. What happens with regard to the boy's understanding during the interaction with the researcher is not mere retrieval of earlier gathered knowledge, or a reaction to a trigger, whether it be the syringe itself or the questions, but a reconstruction of knowledge through a constellation of interactions with researcher and material. If we look at understanding while it occurs in real time, we can only study the person-context aggregation that results from this interactive process and cannot distinguish the unique contribution of the individual components. Van Hert and Fisher, 2009. Even though one can describe what the child does in answer to a specific action or expression of the adult, it is not possible to distinguish the adult's or child's contribution to the variance in understanding during the task. Parallels can be drawn with other teacher-student interactions, such as in scaffolding during instructions and arithmetic lessons. In their model of scaffolding, Van Hert and Steenbeek, 2005, model the process of scaffolding during an arithmetic class taking a dynamic systems approach. Scaffolding is an interactive process in which the student makes progress using the help of a teacher, which scaffold level should be adapted to the student's level in order to have the right effect. One of the most interesting properties of this dynamic model is that it accounts for transactions between teacher and student, and that it portrays a dynamic, real-time combination of both the student's performance level and the scaffold level of the teacher. One of the parameters in the model is the optimal scaffolding distance, a bandwidth which differs among individuals and contexts, within which help stimulates learning. Within that bandwidth, the optimal scaffolding distance is the distance between the pupil's level and the level of help or scaffolding for which the learning effect is maximal. Just like in our model of understanding, the actions of student and teacher form a unique process built of bidirectional relationships, Fogel and Garvey, 2007. In addition to the social context, the material context, such as the syringes, also plays an important role in the process of understanding. The syringes should not be conceived of as fixed or monolithic things, but are instead part of the emerging dynamics. Even an unmovable material object is dynamic in terms of its effect on the child, in the sense that the child continuously changes his angle of vision towards the object and thus sees different parts of the object. The dynamic and intertwining nature of the material context is even more strongly illustrated by the syringe's task, in which the child or the adult manipulate the syringe, and are thus changing the nature of the object in line with their activities. In the example, Table 1, the syringes and tube are frequently touched by the boy and the researcher to emphasize or guide their verbal expressions, see fragments 5, 6, and 10. The best illustration of this, however, can be found in fragments 32 to 36. In this fragment, the boy uses the material extensively, after which a higher level of complexity emerges. He transitions from a sensory motor systems level to a single representation/representational mappings level. Note how the boy substitutes words for gestures and pointing in fragments 32 and 34, following the process of what happens with his hands. Parallels can be drawn with fragment 5, in which the researcher is talking the boy through what happened before. In fragments 32 and 34, however, the boy uses the material instead of the researcher's words to construct his understanding. Before fragment 32, he predicted that one piston comes out when you push the piston of the other syringe in. However, so far, he was not able to explain why. Now, using his hands to examine the syringe, he is able to represent the process, and concludes that it is going through the tube. Eventually, guided by the researcher's question, but what is going through the tube? Which seems to suggest that he is on the right track, he is able to replace the word this in his explanation for psi. In Figure 1, the iterative character of the understanding dynamics between student and researcher is shown in that each previous action of the student has an influence on the subsequent reaction of the researcher, and vice versa. Over time, each session has an influence on the subsequent session of the student-researcher pair, which implies that the influences between the child and environment are bidirectional, meaning that not only the action of the researcher influences the next reaction of the student, but also that the previous interaction influences the next interaction. Iterativeness is thus the form in which the cyclical or reciprocal character of causality occurs. In our example, Table 1, the iterative nature of the process is not only illustrated by how the researcher and child react to what has been said previously throughout the whole transcript, but also by how the child's understanding develops during the interaction. With regard to the prediction he makes in the first half of the interaction, the child goes from I don't know, fragments 2 and 4, no skill level, to this one goes up like this, fragment 6, single representation. This change in understanding is constructed in reaction to what the researcher said right before in fragment 5. With regard to the explanation of the boy why this happens, his understanding goes from because this is attached, fragment 24, sensory motor system, to something goes like this, fragment 32, sensory motor system / single representation, to the psi is going through the tube, fragment 36, single representation / representational mapping. The statement that the tube is attached, which the researcher repeats and emphasizes in fragments 19 and 31, leads to the conclusion that there must be something flowing inside the tube. Since there is no water in the tube fragments 21 and 22, or anything else visible for that matter, it must be psi, fragment 36. This stepwise refining of the boy's understanding, in which each previous step is the beginning of the next step, illustrates the iterative nature of the process nicely. Not only does iterativeness occur on the conversation level, what the child says depends on what the researcher said previously and vice versa, it also occurs on the complexity level of understanding, each understanding of the child depends on the previous understanding. Finally, the iterative nature of the process can also be seen over sessions, meaning that previous sessions influence subsequent sessions. In our example, see Table 1, microgenetical variability is seen in the child's understanding of how the material works. First, in fragment 10 the boy names a single cause for what happens, because we attach the tube. This is an answer on a sensory motor system level, he gives a single, observable causal explanation for the phenomenon, not taking the volume of the syringes or the air into account, see also the third column of Table 1. Over the course of the interaction, he briefly regresses to I don't know, fragments 18 and 20, no skill level, and restores his previously gained skill level again in fragment 24, because this is attached. From there, he further constructs his understanding, and eventually reaches a higher level in fragment 36, the psi is going through the tube, for which he needs a representation of the role of air in the system. In a time serial illustration of the fluctuations in the boy's answer levels during the air pressure task is depicted. The graph shows how the understanding of the boy fluctuates over time. While skill theory's level 4, single representation, is mostly observed during the interaction, the boy also regularly shows understandings at level 3, sensory motor system. Even though his understanding seems to increase in complexity over time, on average the boy reaches level 4 more often in the second half of the interaction, his understanding often regresses to level 3 and to incorrect / irrelevant understandings. Hence, understanding is not a fixed entity, but varies over time, even within a single task. The short-term intra-individual variability influences the variations in development we can see on the long term, Fisher and Beidel, 2006, Van Hert and Fisher, 2009. If microgenetical variability is associated with reaching higher-level skills, Howe and Lewis, 2005, Phelan, 1989, long-term trajectories of understanding may differ between children showing more periods of variability versus children showing little periods of variability within short-term interactions. This also makes sense in combination with the property iterativeness, as a short-term interaction showing a broad range of skill levels makes it more likely that skill levels subsequently move toward a higher level, cf. a phase transition, compared to a previous interaction showing a narrow range of skill levels. After all, the interaction with a broad range of skill levels yields more possibilities for the next interaction than an interaction with a narrow range. In conclusion, as Howe and Lewis, 2005, mention, understanding gets form over various instances and in turn, drives long-term developmental change. This connection between the short and long-term scale of development brings us to the next property, that of interconnected timescales. Time serial illustration of the variability in the boy's understanding during the air pressure task, measured by using skill theory, Fisher, 1980. For this boy, levels on the y-axis range from 1, single sensory motor set, to 4, single representation. A -1 score represents an incorrect or irrelevant answer. 3 months later, the researcher returns with the syringes and the tube. The researcher starts by asking, "Do you remember what we had to do with this?" In response, the boy immediately grasps the material and attaches the tube to the syringes. Then he replies, "Yes, when you push this one in, the air will go over here." He doesn't need more time to think about the process in a stepwise fashion, that it works like this because the tube is attached, that there must be something going through that tube, etc. Based on the previous interaction, he now knows that air is going through the tube and makes the pistons move. Note, however, that this is not a mere retrieval from memory. The boy first attaches the syringes to the tube, and answers afterwards. Moreover, the question of the researcher is phrased in a way that encourages him to think about what they did before. Even though the researcher's role is not as prominent as it was in the previous interaction, the social context still plays a role in the construction of understanding. However, 3 months earlier, the understanding was clearly a co-construction between child and researcher. Now the child can directly introduce this understanding to the interaction, triggered by the researcher's question and the material, but without further interference. Person-context dynamics, social construction. An important part of these context dynamics is the social part of the context, meaning the people around the child. Thus, the development of the child's understanding occurs in interaction with the social environment, for example the teacher, and it is this interaction that drives the process of understanding, enabling the student to receive adaptive assistance and make progress step by step. Hirsch-Pasek, Golenkoff, Burke, and Singer, 2009, Van Heert and Steenbeek, 2005. In our example, see Table 1, the child constructs his answers together with the researcher. The researcher's questions are guided by, and on their turn guide, the child's answers. An illustration of this can be seen in fragments 2 to 6 of Table 1. After the boy answers, he does not know what happens with the syringe he is holding if the researcher pushes the piston of the other one in. The researcher asks him, "What do you think?" In this way, she is trying to get the boy to make predictions, encouraging him to hypothesize. In response, the boy looks around and does not answer the question. The researcher, in turn, helps him getting started by summarizing what he said before and by a verbal repetition of her actions with a task material. After having heard the adult's repetition of her actions, the boy starts to construct an answer on a higher complexity level than before. In terms of skill theory, this answer can be classified as a single representation, as he makes a prediction that goes beyond simpler perception-action couplings. Skill levels, when applicable, are indicated the right column of Table 1. 2 things are important here. First, the researcher is responding to the boy in this way, because he did not know the answer. Had the boy given the answer, she may have pushed the piston in, or asked him to elaborate on his answer. Because the boy does not know the answer, she needs an approach to determine whether he really has no idea, and if so, how she can help him to make a prediction based on what he knows about the syringes. In order to do this, she tries out 2 different approaches. First, she asks him what he thinks, which can be a starting point for further elaboration on his side. When the boy does not reply, she decides to help him to get started by giving some information about what they have done and seen before. The boy now hypothesizes what happens if the piston of one of the syringes is pushed in. The answer to the question, "What do you think will happen?" See Fragment 1 of Table 1, is therefore the product of the interaction between the boy and researcher. In her reactions to the boy's "I don't know," the researcher is trying to guide his understanding. In turn, after hearing the researcher's summary, the boy constructs his understanding. What happens with regard to the boy's understanding during the interaction with the researcher is not mere retrieval of earlier gathered knowledge, or a reaction to a trigger, whether it be the syringe itself or the questions, but a reconstruction of knowledge through a constellation of interactions with researcher and material. If we look at understanding while it occurs in real time, we can only study the person-context aggregation that results from this interactive process and cannot distinguish the unique contribution of the individual components. Van Heert and Fisher, 2009. Even though one can describe what the child does in answer to a specific action or expression of the adult, it is not possible to distinguish the adult's or child's contribution to the variance in understanding during the task. Parallels can be drawn with other teacher-student interactions, such as in scaffolding during instructions and arithmetic lessons. In their model of scaffolding, Van Heert and Steenbeek, 2005, model the process of scaffolding during an arithmetic class taking a dynamic systems approach. Scaffolding is an interactive process in which the student makes progress using the help of a teacher, which scaffold level should be adapted to the student's level in order to have the right effect. One of the most interesting properties of this dynamic model is that it accounts for transactions between teacher and student, and that it portrays a dynamic, real-time combination of both the student's performance level and the scaffold level of the teacher. One of the parameters in the model is the optimal scaffolding distance, a bandwidth which differs among individuals and contexts, within which help stimulates learning. Within that bandwidth, the optimal scaffolding distance is the distance between the pupil's level and the level of help or scaffolding for which the learning effect is maximal. Just like in our model of understanding, the actions of student and teacher form a unique process built of bidirectional relationships, Fogel and Garvey, 2007. Person-context dynamics, the material context. In addition to the social context, the material context, such as the syringes, also plays an important role in the process of understanding. The syringes should not be conceived of as fixed or monolithic things, but are instead part of the emerging dynamics. Even an unmovable material object is dynamic in terms of its effect on the child, in the sense that the child continuously changes his angle of vision towards the object and thus sees different parts of the object. The dynamic and intertwining nature of the material context is even more strongly illustrated by the syringe's task, in which the child or the adult manipulate the syringe, and are thus changing the nature of the object in line with their activities. In the example, Table 1, the syringes and tube are frequently touched by the boy and the researcher to emphasize or guide their verbal expressions, see fragments 5, 6, and 10. The best illustration of this, however, can be found in fragments 32 to 36. In this fragment, the boy uses the material extensively, after which a higher level of complexity emerges. He transitions from a sensory motor systems level to a single representation/representational mappings level. Note how the boy substitutes words for gestures and pointing in fragments 32 and 34, following the process of what happens with his hands. Parallels can be drawn with fragment 5, in which the researcher is talking the boy through what happened before. In fragments 32 and 34, however, the boy uses the material instead of the researcher's words to construct his understanding. Before fragment 32, he predicted that one piston comes out when you push the piston of the other syringe in. However, so far, he was not able to explain why. Now, using his hands to examine the syringe, he is able to represent the process, and concludes that it is going through the tube. Eventually, guided by the researcher's question, but what is going through the tube? Which seems to suggest that he is on the right track, he is able to replace the word this in his explanation for psi. Second property, understanding is an iterative process. In Figure 1, the iterative character of the understanding dynamics between student and researcher is shown in that each previous action of the student has an influence on the subsequent reaction of the researcher, and vice versa. Over time, each session has an influence on the subsequent session of the student-researcher pair, which implies that the influences between the child and environment are bidirectional, meaning that not only the action of the researcher influences the next reaction of the student, but also that the previous interaction influences the next interaction. Iterativeness is thus the form in which the cyclical or reciprocal character of causality occurs. In our example, Table 1, the iterative nature of the process is not only illustrated by how the researcher and child react to what has been said previously throughout the whole transcript, but also by how the child's understanding develops during the interaction. With regard to the prediction he makes in the first half of the interaction, the child goes from I don't know, fragments 2 and 4, no skill level, to this one goes up like this, fragment 6, single representation. This change in understanding is constructed in reaction to what the researcher said right before in fragment 5. With regard to the explanation of the boy why this happens, his understanding goes from because this is attached, fragment 24, sensory motor system, to something goes like this, fragment 32, sensory motor system / single representation, to the psi is going through the tube, fragment 36, single representation / representational mapping. The statement that the tube is attached, which the researcher repeats and emphasizes in fragments 19 and 31, leads to the conclusion that there must be something flowing inside the tube. Since there is no water in the tube fragments 21 and 22, or anything else visible for that matter, it must be psi, fragment 36. This stepwise refining of the boy's understanding, in which each previous step is the beginning of the next step, illustrates the iterative nature of the process nicely. Not only does iterativeness occur on the conversation level, what the child says depends on what the researcher said previously and vice versa, it also occurs on the complexity level of understanding, each understanding of the child depends on the previous understanding. Finally, the iterative nature of the process can also be seen over sessions, meaning that previous sessions influence subsequent sessions. Understanding is microgenetically variable. In our example, see Table 1, microgenetical variability is seen in the child's understanding of how the material works. First, in fragment 10 the boy names a single cause for what happens, because we attach the tube. This is an answer on a sensorimotor system level. He gives a single, observable causal explanation for the phenomenon, not taking the volume of the syringes or the air into account. See also the third column of Table 1. Over the course of the interaction, he briefly regresses to I don't know, fragments 18 and 20, no skill level, and restores his previously gained skill level again in fragment 24, because this is attached. From there, he further constructs his understanding, and eventually reaches a higher level in fragment 36, the psi is going through the tube, for which he needs a representation of the role of air in the system. In a time serial illustration of the fluctuations in the boy's answer levels during the air pressure task is depicted. The graph shows how the understanding of the boy fluctuates over time. While skill theory's level 4, single representation, is mostly observed during the interaction, the boy also regularly shows understandings at level 3, sensorimotor system. Even though his understanding seems to increase in complexity over time, on average the boy reaches level 4 more often in the second half of the interaction, his understanding often regresses to level 3 into incorrect/irrelevant understandings. Hence, understanding is not a fixed entity, but varies over time, even within a single task. The short-term intra-individual variability influences the variations in development we can see on the long term. Fisher and Beidel, 2006, Van Hert and Fisher, 2009. If microgenetical variability is associated with reaching higher-level skills, Howe and Lewis, 2005, Phelan, 1989, long-term trajectories of understanding may differ between children showing more periods of variability versus children showing little periods of variability within short-term interactions. This also makes sense in combination with the property iterativeness, as a short-term interaction showing a broad range of skill levels makes it more likely that skill levels subsequently move toward a higher level, cf. a phase transition, compared to a previous interaction showing a narrow range of skill levels. After all, the interaction with a broad range of skill levels yields more possibilities for the next interaction than an interaction with a narrow range. In conclusion, as Howe and Lewis, 2005, mention, understanding gets form over various instances and in turn, drives long-term developmental change. This connection between the short and long-term scale of development brings us to the next property, that of interconnected timescales. Fourth property, interconnected timescales. 3 months later, the researcher returns with the syringes and the tube. The researcher starts by asking, "Do you remember what we had to do with this?" In response, the boy immediately grasps the material and attaches the tube to the syringes. Then he replies, "Yes, when you push this one in, the air will go over here." He doesn't need more time to think about the process in a stepwise fashion, that it works like this because the tube is attached, that there must be something going through that tube, etc. Based on the previous interaction, he now knows that air is going through the tube and makes the pistons move. Note, however, that this is not a mere retrieval from memory. The boy first attaches the syringes to the tube, and answers afterwards. Moreover, the question of the researcher is phrased in a way that encourages him to think about what they did before. Even though the researcher's role is not as prominent as it was in the previous interaction, the social context still plays a role in the construction of understanding. However, 3 months earlier, the understanding was clearly a co-construction between child and researcher. Now the child can directly introduce this understanding to the interaction, triggered by the researcher's question in the material, but without further interference. 6. Discussion. From a theoretical point of view, We discussed a number of dynamic properties in combination with skill theory's ruler of cognitive development. We argued that using these properties and ruler give both educators and researchers important means to get a grip on how children's understanding of scientific concepts builds up over time. More specifically, it helps to understand how children organize their knowledge in concordance with the context, i.e. the teacher, and highlights the importance of being aware of teachers' accounts in conversations with children, for example during a science lesson. There are many different types of knowledge generation processes, one of which is the socially situated process between adult, child and task that we are discussing here. When a child is assessed or diagnosed, a different process of knowledge generation occurs. In these instances, the child is asked to construct knowledge without the help of an adult, but usually in interaction with a particular symbolic substrate, such as a piece of paper to draw on, or the structure of language that the child is using to describe knowledge. It is however wrong to think that only the latter process, in which the child works without help, is a reflection of the child's real knowledge. In fact, both the co-constructed as well as the individually constructed knowledge reflect the child's real understanding. Variations in complexity levels within one type of knowledge generation, but also between different types of knowledge generation, illustrate the intrinsic variation of understanding as such. The model we propose helps in reconceptualizing the process of understanding in individual children, and the underlying mechanisms of change in their understanding. The latter is especially important, since developmental psychologists are not simply interested in the stable states achieved by individuals along their lifespan, but also about the mechanisms of change that lead from one state to the next. Howe and Lewis, 2005, p. 248. The advantage of a dynamic systems approach to the study of understanding is that it makes the development of understanding more transparent and no longer limited to an invisible process inside the individual learner, Van Hert and Fisher, 2009. Instead, it enables us to closely monitor interactions between child and environment to determine how the outcome, a form of understanding at some point, is constructed in real time. In an applied sense, it is of great importance for parents, science, teachers, and other practitioners to have knowledge about how children grasp varied concepts and how their understanding develops over time. By having this knowledge, they will be able to challenge children in their current level of understanding in order to promote children's optimal developmental trajectories with regard to cognitive understanding, and by doing so, promote children's optimal development in a broader sense. Departing from the idea of understanding as a process of change in which the child and the social and material context intertwine, the ways and complexity levels at which educators interact with their pupils have an important influence on the development of understanding. With regard to iterativeness, it is important for educators to acknowledge that how understanding changes at one moment in time depends on the understanding at a previous time point. That is, from a dynamic systems perspective, there are no internal operations on representations of knowledge that cause intellectual growth. Understanding organizes on the spot, and gets internalized over time through multiple interactions with the environment. Regarding microgenetical variability, it is important for educators to understand that the highest complexity level on which children operate, for example when they learn about scientific concepts, can change rapidly during short-term interactions, not only when the environment or the amount of support visibly changes. Finally, a better understanding of the temporal stream of understanding will help educators to become aware of their own role in the long-term learning process, and may help them to change their actions when necessary or wanted. Students who are engaged in scientific discovery, learning need adequate support to construct their knowledge. Alfieri, Brooks, Aldrich, and Tenenbaum, 2010. We claim that teachers' awareness of their own role is an important indicator for the quality of their support, which is a crucial factor in improving children's learning. McKinsey, 2007. We need to work further on completing the empirical picture of possible trajectories of understanding that can emerge in individual children and investigate how these are related to processes on the short-term time scale. This will help us to differentiate components that build up to children's successful and unsuccessful learning trajectories with regard to scientific understanding. This knowledge will also help science educators to teach children to successfully master scientific concepts, as children's understanding of scientific concepts is not always accurate. Grotzer, 2004. When children have more expertise in science, feel confident about this, and enjoy science lessons, This may eventually boost the current number of young people pursuing a scientific academic career. In order to maintain economic growth, people with a scientific education who can ensure continuous technical capability of the highest standards in all fields of expertise are very much needed. An important next step in the study of the development of children's understanding of scientific concepts as a dynamic system is to try to map individual learning trajectories and build a dynamic simulation model, based on a general theory of action or agent behavior on interacting timescales, and a general theory of mechanisms of change. See Van Hert, 1994, Van Hert and Steenbeek, 2008, Steenbeek, 2006. With the help of such a simulation model, the important role of the science educator in the emergence of understanding can be unraveled. As a result, such a simulation model will have an important educational value, by making the dynamic principles that play a crucial role in the development of understanding accessible for a broader public of educators. Based on the short-term interaction patterns we see emerge, and the implications this has for the long term, we can eventually construct adaptive teaching programs, lessons and materials for science education, which are better adapted to children's current levels of understanding and how this understanding develops in interaction. An example of an adaptive educational and assessment, computer, program is MathGarden, van der Moss, Klinkenberg, and Stratemeyer, 2010, an educational computer game with a wide range of sums children that can play at school or at home. Children's responses, the short-term child-computer interactions, are frequently analyzed and reported to their teachers by means of error analyses, individual growth curves, and comparisons between the particular child and his classmates, or the broader population of peers. The program itself uses the child's data by varying the complexity of the sums adaptively, depending on the percentage of right answers, but also on the child's reaction time. Moreover, using the responses and reaction times of all individual children, the items of MathGarden are arranged, and get frequently rearranged, in terms of complexity. This program shows how multiple short-term interactions provide information about the individual's long-term development and how this information can inform educational practice. These kinds of adaptive teaching and assessment programs translate dynamic principles into concrete materials that help children to develop their understanding in an optimal way. In conclusion, as Vygotsky, 1934-1986, already noted, to devise successful methods of instructing the schoolchild in systematic knowledge, it is necessary to understand the development of scientific concepts in the child's mind. No less important than this practical aspect of the problem is its theoretical significance for psychological science. p. 146. We think that by studying the development of children's understanding of scientific concepts using a model based on properties derived from dynamic systems theory and skill theory, an important contribution to both this applied and scientific goal is made. Introduction. Teacher, now, kids, this is a course about dinosaurs. Are dinosaurs alive today? Preschooler 1, yeah, at the zoo. Preschooler 2, I saw one on TV. Teacher, the ones at the zoo are just pretend dinosaurs, aren't they? Children nod. Does anyone know what the word extinct means? Preschooler 3, I farted. Teacher, say excuse me. Preschooler 3 continues, in my house. Teacher, let's keep thinking about dinosaurs. 30 minutes later, teacher, okay, listen up. I want you to think about what you've learned today. Can anyone tell me something they learned about dinosaurs? Several preschoolers, they're mean. Teacher, they're mean. Okay. Does anyone remember what the word extinct means? Preschooler 4, farted. Pfeiffer, 2012. After Piaget's seminal claims on children's slow emergence of adult-like thought, research in cognitive development has skyrocketed to reveal ever so amazing competencies in younger and younger children. These competencies pertain to understanding cause-effect relations, physical truisms, or mathematical operations, to name just a few. For example, see Bremner and Fogel, 2004, for a summary. Many of these findings have had the effect of changing how children are taught, for example by pushing more complex curricula early on, building upon children's already existing understanding, and supporting children's abstract reasoning skills. For example, Brenneman, Stevenson, Boyd and Freda, 2009, Ashok and Fried, 2005. In the current lecture we review the research findings of these efforts, focusing explicitly on early science learning. The area of science learning, while only a small part within the field of children's learning, has several features that warrant interest for the cognitive development community. First, science concepts are abstract, transcending a concrete context that commonly embeds everyday concepts. As such, science learning relates to the emergence of abstract thought, knowledge transfer and symbol manipulation. Second, scientific concept formation is a specific case of everyday concept formation, thus shedding light on the dynamics of collapsing large amounts of information into systematic beliefs, cf. Havu Newtonen, 2005. Third, a focus on early learning is likely to uncover the spontaneous working of the mind, processes yet unaffected by formal instruction or by standardized assessment. An understanding of preschooler science learning therefore transcends the field of early childhood education and sheds light on the spontaneous development of abstract thought in young children. Note first that early science learning is a rather unorganized terrain. Unlike the areas of reading or math, this area still grapples with questions of what constitutes success in science learning, how learning should progress, and how to assess its milestones. There are no generally agreed upon letters that form the alphabet of science, and there are no central operations in science that constitute the base upon which to build. Indeed, research studies differ greatly in how science is defined in the first place, for example whether science concepts need to be abstract, relevant to everyday experience, or interconnected with other concepts. Similarly, assessment tools differ greatly in whether they measure the presence of a particular concept, the way it is applied, or its semantic network. As a result, there are no generally accepted instructional tools, cf. Kirchner, Sweller, and Clark, 2006, and there are no generally accepted assessments that could capture milestones of science learning across curricula. For review see Brenneman, 2011, Scott Little, Lesko, Martella, and Milburn, 2007. The current lecture is a first step towards filling this gap. For our purposes, science is defined to incorporate two aspects: scientific facts and concepts, and the processes by which science knowledge is generated. These two aspects, knowledge of science concepts and knowledge of how the science concepts were derived, are of course closely linked, cf. Schäuble, 1990. We nevertheless treat them as separate for the purpose of organizing the research findings on early science learning. Note also that this review is by no means exhaustive. The literature on young children's science learning has exploded in the last decade, being published in numerous educational and cognitive development journals, as well as in journals devoted to this topic entirely, for example, Science and Children, Research in Science Education. Here we present a cross-section of pertinent research, as a means of finding a common thread and setting the stage for a more integrated discussion about young children's learning. For example, we describe research on how to support young children's reasoning about abstract concepts, how to replace their mistaken beliefs with more appropriate ones, how to engage them in scientific discourse and explorations, and how to scaffold their attempt to organize isolated pieces of knowledge into coherent networks of interrelated facts. Can preschoolers learn about scientific facts? A central part of science is a shared understanding of concepts and facts, for example from the domain of physical sciences, life sciences, or earth and space sciences. Research in cognitive development has documented that even young children know something about these science domains. For example, young children know that the behavior of objects is affected by their physical properties, cf. Kotovsky and Bayerjan, 1998, Schilling and Clifton, 1998, they know that the identity of living things is determined internally, Simons and Kyle, 1995, Springer, 1995, and they understand the effect of gravity, for example, Wozniacki, 1994. Of course, sometimes their beliefs are mistaken, they hold misconceptions. For example, children believe that heavy stuff sinks fast, for example, Cluse and Somerville, 2001, Pinner and Clare, 1996, that the sun is alive, but not plants, Vinville, 2004, or that the earth is disc-shaped, for example, Wozniacki and Brewer, 1992. To what extent can early science instruction build upon children's existing knowledge to convey new facts and change mistaken beliefs? Conveying something new. Science facts differ in the degree to which they rely on concrete versus abstract pieces of information. That is to say, Science facts vary in whether relevant pieces of information are readily perceivable, or whether they need to be extracted from irrelevant information. That a spider has 8 legs requires a relatively low level of abstraction, because the facts relevant pieces of information are readily accessible in a single event. By contrast, the idea that caterpillars turn into butterflies is more abstract. Caterpillars and butterflies need to be conceptually connected, while differences between the two need to be ignored, for example, shape, behavior. Similarly, the idea that water can turn into ice is less abstract than the idea that materials consist of particles that are invisible to the naked eye. The latter requires the learner to ignore salient features of an object, for example, the shape or size of a material, and instead note underlying patterns of how materials interact and change. Can young children learn low abstraction science facts? This question is relatively trivial, as one might guess from everyday experiences with children, for example, Cumming, 2003. For example, preschoolers can learn with little effort the names of new species, the names of the planets, and even the terms associated with material properties and chemical change, for example, Fleer and Hardy, 1993. However, educators sometimes worry that children's learning of facts is no more than passive rote memorization, far from reflecting truly understanding the facts. At the crux of this concern is that young children might not be able to go beyond mere facts to interconnect them under a common concept. Even though there is evidence of spontaneous abstractions in young children, for example, Hickling and Gelman 1995, Hickling and Wellman, 2001, higher order concepts pertinent to science knowledge might be too abstract for them. The more central question, therefore, is whether young children can learn abstract concepts. There is an interesting drawback when it comes to learning abstract concepts. Unlike what one would expect, findings show that overly detailed and richly embedded learning materials have a negative impact on children's ability to abstract underlying concepts. For example, Goldstone and Sakamoto, 2003, Goldstone, and Son, 2005, Kaminsky, Slotsky, and Heckler, 2008, Ratterman, Gentner, and Deloche, 1990, Son, Smith, and Goldstone, 2008. For example, when the learning materials were color-shaped intricately, children had more difficulty discovering an abstract mathematical rule than when the materials were black and white simple shapes, Kaminsky et al., 2008. When the shapes were such that they helped children intuit the rules, learning improved, but transfer to a new task nevertheless suffered, compared to using non-specific and generic shapes. See also Deloche, 1995, Basak and Holyoke, 1989, Mix, 1999, Ratterman and Gentner, 1998, Slotsky, Kaminsky, and Heckler, 2005, Utal, Liu, and Deloche, 1999, Utal, Scudder, and Deloche, 1997. Taken together, there seems to be a pronounced advantage of sparse context when learning abstract concepts. The advantage lies in minimizing distraction, undermining the possibility of forming mistaken ideas, and highlighting relevant pieces of information. Of course, when it comes to young children, a motivational factor needs to be taken into account, cf. Mansikopoulos, Patrick, and Samarapungavan 2008, Zimbalas, 2008. A setting without rich details might fail to engage the child sufficiently to prompt learning. For example, a young child might not be inclined to explore objects unless they vary in color, shape, and texture in interesting ways. Therefore, to make abstract ideas accessible to young children, it might not be possible to strip the context of any unnecessary complexity. A different approach to instruction is needed, one that helps make abstract ideas visible to children, while, at the same time, retaining a richly detailed context. Such approach might require a pedagogy that bootstraps the understanding of abstract ideas, rather than waiting for young children to detect them by themselves. Findings show that such approach is indeed possible. Take for example the abstract idea of object conservation, the idea that matter exists, even when it is not visible with the naked eye. To understand this concept, children have to ignore their phenomenological experience of an object's presence and therefore engage in abstract reasoning. Immersing children into a richly detailed environment might not make this abstract idea salient. On the other hand, providing children with the opportunity to reflect on guided explorations of material transformation improved their understanding of object conservation, Aker, Arca, and San Marti, 2007. In particular, 7 to 8-year-olds were asked to observe possible changes in materials, for example, stones, wood, water, metal, when they were trying to break them down, mix them in water, or burn them. After each manipulation, children were encouraged to draw the changes they observed in the materials. They also participated in group discussions designed to help them conceptualize their experiences. Findings show not only that children were able to express opinions and counter-arguments, but also that they could understand object conservation. Even 5-year-old preschoolers can appreciate the idea that water, when invisible to the naked eye, is nevertheless still present in some form. Tytler and Peterson, 2000. Replacing existing beliefs. Learning about a new science concept can be problematic, beyond the required abstract reasoning skills. This is because in some cases, children's naive ideas about the domain conflict with the pertinent science concept. The detrimental power of mistaken ideas has been recognized for decades, leading to extensive research into understanding both the nature of the misconceptions across ages and how they can be changed. For example, C. Olson, 2011, Vozniatu, 2008, for an extensive discussion. Indeed, existing misconceptions appear to be very difficult to change. For example, Anderson and Smith, L. 987, Gunstone, Champagne, and Klopfer, 1981, Honest, and Kikis, 2007, Cluse and Somerville, 2001, Lynn and Goebbels, 1988, Schemps, 1987. In many instances, children prefer mistaken ideas over correct ideas, even after extensive training and even after shortcomings of mistaken ideas have been pointed out explicitly. Take for example findings with 5 to 7-year-olds who participated in an astronomy curriculum on the spherical properties of the Earth, Honest, and Kikis, 2007. The 4E curriculum involved hands-on mini lessons designed to target several apparent contractions, for example why the Earth is perceived to be flat, or why people living on the downside of the Earth do not fall off. Yet, despite this relatively extensive intervention, children's understanding did not change significantly over the course of the instruction. While their performance on a pretest was below chance, 11% correct, it stayed low even after the lessons, 15% correct. In fact, results show that children relied more heavily on their phenomenological experience after instruction than before. See also Cluse and Van Orden, 2005 for similar counter effects of teaching interventions. Given such resistance to change, one might speculate that a child's mistaken ideas are innate. But upon closer look into the nature of beliefs, it turns out that misconceptions arise when misleading pieces of information are more salient than pieces of information that are relevant to the particular science concept. Cf. Cluse, Fisher, and Van Orden, 2010. Therefore, to change a child's mistaken ideas in a science domain, a pedagogical approach is needed that can change the salience of relevant compared to irrelevant pieces of information, i.e., increase the salience of science-relevant pieces of information. With such change in making relevant information salient, misconceptions might be avoided altogether. Indeed, children who have benefited from focused instruction seem to harbor fewer misconceptions in later years at school. Cf. Novak and Govin, 1984. A promising approach in this regard is the use of conceptual models, also known as conceptual schemas, mental models, or scientific models, e.g., Glenn and Deutsch, 1995, Kenyon, Schwartz, and Hug, 2008, Meyer, 1989, Penner, Giles, Lehrer, and Schäuble, 1997, Smith, Sneer, and Grossleit, 1992, Smith and Unger, 1997, for review see Vozniatu, 2008. Conceptual models are abstract representations of a science phenomenon, external diagrams of some sort that children can internalize. Models do not represent the real world in its full degree of complexity. Instead, they are schematics of the real world, designed to highlight only a selected number of relations, the ones that are relevant to the science concept of interest, while downplaying other relations, ones that are less relevant or misleading. Importantly, models represent predictive and explanatory rules, thus making visible the components of science phenomenon that are difficult to be perceived on the basis of phenomenological experience alone. As such, they make relevant science facts salient, in effect decreasing the salience of irrelevant pieces of information. There are several studies that show the effectiveness of conceptual models in young children, for example, Gobert and Buckley, 2000, Kenyon et al. 2008, Weiser and Smith, 2008, Baker, Osman, Kloos, and Fisher, 2011. An illustrative example uses the science domain of material density, a concept that is defined by the ratio of the two highly salient dimensions of mass and volume. Predictably, children often ignore density and use instead perceived heaviness of an object as the sole predictor of the object's buoyancy, for example, Piaget and Enhelder, 1974, Kloos et al., 2010. To help children overcome this mistaken focus on an object's heaviness, a conceptual model of density was developed, also known as dot per box, for example, Smith and Unger, 1997, Weiser and Smith, 2008. It involves a display in which the volume of an object is represented as a certain number of boxes, and mass is represented as number of dots inside the boxes. Thus, density is represented as the spacing between dots. The more crowded the dots, the more dense the material, and irrelevant variation of color, shape, and texture are omitted. Thus, density of the material is now similar in salience to that of mass or volume. Children indeed benefited from these abstract representations of density. For a discussion of these findings, see Weiser and Smith, 2008. Similar learning success was reported with 4 to 5-year-olds, whether children were recruited from Head Start preschools or from preschools serving upper middle class families, Baker et al., 2011. Introducing conceptual models early on might have a positive effect on learning as children get older. Support for this claim comes from research in the domain of evaporation and condensation, another domain that is a notoriously difficult area of instruction in science, Kenyon et al., 2008. Children between 6 and 8 years of age underwent a multi-week training on evaporation and condensation, which included observing the evaporation and condensation in a soda bottle, drawing diagrams to capture the system through various moments in time, testing their models through experiments, using tools to measure the amount of water in the air, and revising their models as needed. Findings show that the instructed students significantly outperformed the uninstructed students in their understanding of relevant concepts. Importantly, when students began the formal study of science in grade 7, instructed students improve in their understanding of concepts much faster than uninstructed students. Clearly, the students who were helped to form basic science concepts in early grades had developed an understanding of the domain that continued to facilitate their meaningful learning, further developing their understandings and reducing their misconceptions. For related discussions, see Mathakrishna, Carnini, Grossen, and Miller, 1993. In sum, research-based evidence points in a clear direction when it comes to promoting an understanding of science concepts. Unlike what a Piagetian stage model of abstract reasoning might imply, young children are indeed able to learn abstract concepts early on, even when the concepts run counter to what children already believe. Their learning strongly depends on an instructional environment that makes abstract relations salient, allowing them to visualize the relations without getting distracted by irrelevant information in the immediate context. To put it more pointedly, the limits on a child's ability to learn abstract science concepts might be the limits of the instruction that is provided. Open questions pertain to the exact interplay between decontextualized and carefully simplified environments to maximize children's learning about science concepts and events directly related to their lives, for example, food, weather, seasons, animals, vehicles, light, magnets, etc. Can preschoolers learn to generate science knowledge? The second aspect of science learning pertains to understanding the process by which science knowledge is generated. Rather than learning about established and accepted science facts and concepts, this aspect includes an understanding of how science facts are generated in the first place. This includes the ability to create settings that are sufficiently informative for science knowledge to be generated. And it includes the metacognitive understanding of how new information can change existing knowledge. It is important to note that the process of generating science concepts is in part affected by cultural norms. Norms pertain to constraints about what to count as an explanation of events, cf. Pearl, 2009, Under what circumstances to abandon an existing theory, cf. Kuhn, 1996, or how to treat expected versus unexpected observations, cf. Popper, 1959. So far, these constraints have not been studied explicitly in the realm of early science learning. Instead, the emphasis is on understanding how children's everyday interactions with their environment can help children generate science knowledge, for example, Zimmerman, 2000. The question of children's ability to generate science knowledge through observations is debated heavily, both in cognitive development and in educational research. In cognitive development, the ongoing debate centers on the question of whether young children are at all capable of engaging in appropriate knowledge-generating activities. Such activities, referred to as scientific reasoning, require the child to detect gaps in their existing knowledge base, ask questions in response to the identified gaps, carry out the experiments that could lead to an answer, and critically evaluate the evidence, cf. Clare, 2005. Each one of these steps can be difficult for children, and even for adults, for several reasons. First, the mind is biased towards perceiving order, making it difficult to perceive disorder, missing information, or gaps, cf. for example, Quinn, Imus, and Rosenkrantz, 1993. Second, the mind is biased towards confirming already existing beliefs, rather than questioning their shortcomings, making it difficult to spontaneously challenge existing beliefs, for example, Schorble, 1990. Under this view, scientific reasoning has to be trained explicitly. In contrast to the cognitive development debate, educational research already presupposes the child's ability to generate science knowledge, following the theoretical bent of constructivism, cf. Olson, 1996. For example, it is generally accepted that children can engage in inquiry, the processes of wondering, questioning, exploring, investigating, discussing, reflecting, and formulating ideas and theories, for example, Kuhn, 2010. Indeed, preschool education places strong emphasis on exploration, the idea being that exploration is at the center of what allows children to generate knowledge about the world, for example, Lucan, Carr, and Brown, 2011. The debate then centers on the question of how children's spontaneous inquiry can be supported by teacher interventions, explicit instruction, and/or feedback. In what follows, we review findings that speak to this question. In particular, we focus on the efficacy of 3 strategies that help children generate science knowledge. They include, 1. Engaging children in scientific discourse, 2. Teaching them to keep track of their observations, and 3. Helping them organize their knowledge. Can young children engage in scientific discourse? What is also referred to as science talk, Lemke, 1990, or exploratory language, Peterson and French, 2008, scientific discourse differs from a standard question-answer format for which the person asking the question already knows, expects to hear, and rewards the right answer. Scientific discourse instead promotes sense-making of events, accepted science terms, concepts, and methods are transmitted in the context of children asking scientifically valid questions, cf. Crowder, 1996. It is therefore a large part of inquiry and scientific reasoning. While scientific discourse is heavily studied in school-age children, for example, Kafai and Carter Ching, 2001, preschool teachers and parents of young children are likely to engage in such discourse naturally, as they guide children's explorations of topics relevant to their everyday life. The ideal context is likely to require an active and knowledgeable listeners and a shared science vocabulary that children are sufficiently comfortable with, cf. Crowley, Callanan, Gibson, et al., 2001, Fleer, 1996, Pramling and Pramling-Samuelson, 2001. The effectiveness of science talk with preschoolers was demonstrated empirically with the domains of metamorphosis and plant growth, for example, Witt and Kempel, 2008. Children were first given a pretest on these 2 science domains, asking questions such as what is a cocoon? What kind of food helps caterpillars and butterflies grow? How does a plant soak up water? And do seeds grow faster in direct sunlight, darkness, or a mixture of both? Preschoolers then participated in 2 several weeks-long activities, one pertaining to creating an environment for caterpillars and observing the metamorphosis, and one pertaining to planting seeds and observing the growth in different climates and environments, for example, hot and sunny versus cold and dark. Preschoolers were frequently engaged in conversations, allowing them to reflect on their observations and experience. Post-test performance showed remarkable improvement in science knowledge, every child improved in their answers, and every question showed gains. For example, while none of the preschoolers knew the meaning of cocoon or the conditions under which seeds grow best, all of them did so during the post-test. Promising results for the effectiveness of science talk were also reported with the domain of electrical currents, Fleer, 1991, Fleer and Beasley, 1991. The task was to explore flashlights, find out what they are made out of and how they work, and construct their own flashlights using batteries, bulbs, and wires. With the use of guided interaction with the teachers, preschoolers and first graders learned to formulate questions about the working of the flashlights, and they learned to report the findings of their own explorations. Even better results were obtained when children were given direct instruction on how the electricity flowed around the circuit, both through the reading of factual courses, and through one-on-one interactions with the teachers as children explored the materials. In particular, after direct instruction, all children could talk about how the electricity continuously flowed around a simple electric circuit, an understanding they still held 2 months later. Without such direct instruction, and despite being able to connect the circuit, children's beliefs about electricity, measured through their entries in a note course, did not change over the course of 3 months. All children with comparison data expressed exactly the same view of electricity in both interviews. As this previous study implies, a scientific discourse is aided when children can keep track of their explorations across time, for example in science journals. This is not only because children are exposed to richer information over time, for example, to detect a contrast in an abstract dimension that is not available in snapshot events. Science journals also provide teachers with an opportunity to engage children in a targeted and individualized way, cf. Doris, 1991, Light and Simmons 1983. Recent findings show that even preschoolers can be taught to keep a science journal, for example, Brenneman and Lauro 2008. This might involve oversimplified drawings and an explanation written by a teacher. Nevertheless, they provide an authentic medium for teachers to encourage scientific reasoning. For example, children's drawings make it possible for teachers to convey the difference between true observations and a child's imagination, the importance of dating the entries, and the focus on hidden features, for example, the inside of a pumpkin. The outcome was a rich interaction between teachers and preschoolers, promoting children's ability to observe objectively, to record observations with some precision, and to become aware of patterns of change. So far, we have discussed the benefits of engaging children in science talk and encouraging them to make note of their observations. An even more targeted way of helping children generate science knowledge involves helping them organize their observations and beliefs in a systematic way. It involves the use of so-called concept maps, cf. Novak, 2010. Concept maps consist of nodes, to represent objects, and arrows between nodes, to represent events. The resulting flow charts, for example, plants go in gardens, can be organized hierarchically to capture the relations between what children think and experience. For example, when presented with a targeted question about the cycle of growth, concepts maps make it possible for children to organize information about animals and plants in a way that yields both relevant science knowledge and an understanding of how such knowledge could be generated. The Young Florida Naturalist program used such a concept map strategy with 3 to 4-year-olds from urban early childhood center children, for example, Hunter, Monroe Aussie, and Fountain, 2008. The goal was to increase children's knowledge about the butterfly life cycle and plant growth over the course of an 8-week instructional period. A concept map was constructed first, using a set of pertinent pictures, for example, tree roots, leaves, caterpillars, butterflies, cocoons, to capture children's initial understandings. The concept map was then posted in the classroom as a point of reference, and to allow for modifications as children learn new information. To stimulate children's thinking, a butterfly garden was planted on the center's grounds, and children engaged in various experiments with water, sunlight, soil, etc. to explore plant growth. At the end of the period, children's understanding was assessed in semi-structured interviews to infer a child's individual concept map. For example, children were asked to sort and organize a set of pictures, they were encouraged to talk about what they know about plants and butterflies, and they were asked about their understandings of the final class concept map. For example, what do the pictures tell you about plants? Results document that a large majority of both 3 and 4-year-olds could make higher order propositions, and they could recall terms and concepts relevant to parts of plants and aspects of butterfly transformation. Taken together, these results show that young children can benefit from quite sophisticated adult support in order to generate science-relevant knowledge. That is to say, children's natural curiosity can be harnessed to help them explore their surroundings in scientifically appropriate ways. Adult support can range from merely providing children with a context for explorations to engaging them in guided discussions about their explorations, to helping them document their findings and organize their thoughts. As part of this process, young children are likely to learn the cultural norms of what is considered science, what counts as a worthwhile phenomenon, how it should be explored and evaluated, and what kind of knowledge construal would be acceptable, i.e., what can be ignored and what must be included. Open questions pertain to the relative benefit of allowing children to develop their own representations of what they observe versus working with representations provided to them in a top-down fashion. Coda? Science is a rather difficult subject to teach, for several reasons. First, relevant science concepts are often far less salient than superficial aspects of an observation. In fact, superficial features lead to mistaken beliefs that resist change. Second, science explorations require a level of systematicity that is difficult for young children to attain. Young children get easily distracted, failing to isolate relevant variables or to note their effect. Third, agreed upon scientific knowledge is incomplete, at least to some extent. It includes necessary simplifications to capture general rules and usable models. As such, there are choices to be made in terms of what to consider a valid science understanding. And finally, given that science understanding depends on the acquisition of a novel nomenclature and seemingly isolated facts, science learning can be dull and unmotivating. Nevertheless, young children are equipped to learn about scientific concepts early on, as cognitive development research shows. Most importantly, they can organize individual experiences into overarching patterns early on, cf. Thagard, 2000, a process that forms the basic building block of the abstract reasoning necessary in science learning. Building upon these abilities, a variety of methods and pedagogical tools have shown to support early science learning. For example, Worth and Grollman, 2003, Chalufor and Worth, 2003, 2004, 2005. Summarizing across the available findings, the following aspects appear to play a crucial role. First, science learning is aided when children engage with scientifically literate adults who understand how to use scientifically valid representations and who anticipate children's already existing ideas about science, cf. Davis and Kratchkick, 2005. Second, science learning is aided when intentional teaching is incorporated with play, such that teaching practices not only become purposeful and thoughtful, but also engage young children with topic-specific phenomena and inquiry, cf. Bodrova and Leong, 2007, Crowley and Jacobs, 2002, Koppel and Bredekamp, 2009, Naik, 2009. The promise is to make accessible relevant science concepts to young children, even abstract concepts and those that run counter to already existing beliefs, forming the foundation upon which young learners will construct their ideas later in life, cf. Lucas, 1993. Research on early science learning also highlights the gaps that still remain in our understanding of children's learning, cf. Davis, 2009. In fact, existing efforts to measure early science learning might be merely a first step. A more complete understanding calls for findings on how to best organize a child's science education throughout the curriculum, how to measure their progress across science domains, how to harness individual differences among children, and what kind of early exposure leads to long-term gains in science learning. Related, empirical questions still remain about how inquiry and explorations interface with direct instructions of science concepts, and how a child's attitude towards science learning both affects and is affected by learning of science. Without research-based findings to speak to these issues, our intuitions about early science learning, while fueling arguments among various viewpoints, might nevertheless jeopardize progression in the area of early science learning. Working on this paper was partly funded through awards from the National Science Foundation to HK, DRL 07236338, and to VC, Air Bay, and HK, DRL 1114674. Please address correspondence to Heidi Kloos, heidi.kloos@uc.edu. Introduction. Scientific reasoning encompasses the reasoning and problem-solving skills involved in generating, testing and revising hypotheses or theories, and in the case of fully developed skills, reflecting on the process of knowledge acquisition and knowledge change that results from such inquiry activities. Science, as a cultural institution, represents a hallmark intellectual achievement of the human species, and these achievements are driven by both individual reasoning and collaborative cognition. Feist, 2006, p. 9. Our goal in this lecture is to describe how young children build from their natural curiosity about their world to having the skills for systematically observing, predicting, and understanding that world. We suggest that scientific reasoning is a specific type of intentional information seeking, one that shares basic reasoning mechanisms and motivation with other types of information seeking. Kuhn, 2011a. For example, curiosity is a critical motivational component that underlies information seeking. Giraud and Claire, 2012. Yet only in scientific reasoning is curiosity sated by deliberate data collection and formal analysis of evidence. In this way, scientific reasoning differs from other types of information seeking in that it requires additional cognitive resources as well as an integration of cultural tools. To that end, we provide an overview of how scientific reasoning emerges from the interaction between internal factors, for example, cognitive and metacognitive development, and cultural and contextual factors. The current state of empirical research on scientific reasoning presents seemingly contradictory conclusions. Young children are sometimes deemed little scientists because they appear to have abilities that are used in formal scientific reasoning, for example, causal reasoning, Gopnik et al., 2004. At the same time, many studies show that older children, and sometimes adults, have difficulties with scientific reasoning. For example, children have difficulty in systematically designing controlled experiments, in drawing appropriate conclusions based on evidence, and in interpreting evidence. For example, Croker, 2012, Chen and Claire, 1999, Kuhn, 1989, Zimmerman, 2007. In the following account, we suggest that despite the early emergence of many of the precursors of skilled scientific reasoning, its developmental trajectory is slow and requires instruction, support, and practice. In section 2 of the lecture, we discuss cognitive and metacognitive factors. We focus on two mechanisms that play a critical role in all cognitive processes, i.e., encoding and strategy acquisition/selection. Encoding involves attention to relevant information, it is foundational in all reasoning. Strategy use involves intentional approaches to seeking new knowledge and synthesizing existing knowledge. These two mechanisms are key components for any type of intentional information seeking, yet follow a slightly different development trajectory in the development of scientific reasoning skills. We then discuss the analogous development of metacognitive awareness of what is being encoded, and metastrategic skills for choosing and deploying hypothesis testing and inference strategies. In section 3, we describe the role of contextual factors such as direct and scaffolded instruction, and the cultural tools that support the development of the cognitive and metacognitive skills required for the emergence of scientific thinking. The development of scientific reasoning. Effective scientific reasoning requires both deductive and inductive skills. Individuals must understand how to assess what is currently known or believed, develop testable questions, test hypotheses, and draw appropriate conclusions by coordinating empirical evidence and theory. Such reasoning also requires the ability to attend to information systematically and draw reasonable inferences from patterns that are observed. Further, it requires the ability to assess one's reasoning at each stage in the process. Here, we describe some of the key issues in developing these cognitive and metacognitive scientific reasoning skills. The main task for developmental researchers is to explain how children build on their intuitive curiosity about the world to become skilled scientific reasoners. Curiosity, defined as the threshold of desired uncertainty in the environment that leads to exploratory behavior, Giraud and Claire, 2012, p. 150, will lead to information seeking. Information seeking activates a number of basic cognitive mechanisms that are used to extract, encode, information from the environment, and then children, and adults, can act on this information in order to achieve a goal, i.e., use a strategy. Claire, 2001, Kuhn, 2010. We turn our discussion to two such mechanisms and discuss how these mechanisms underlie the development of a specific type of information seeking, scientific reasoning. A mechanistic account of the development of scientific reasoning includes information about the processes by which this change occurs, and how these processes lead to change over time. Clare, 2001. Mechanisms can be described at varying levels, for example, neurological, cognitive, interpersonal, and over different time scales. For example, neurological mechanisms, for example, inhibition, operate at millisecond time scales. Burley, Badala, Tendonida, and Hasbrook, 2004, while learning mechanisms may operate over the course of minutes, for example, inhibiting irrelevant information during problem solving. Becker, 2010. Many of the cognitive processes and mechanisms that account for learning and for problem solving across a variety of domains are important to the development of scientific reasoning skills and science knowledge acquisition. Many cognitive mechanisms have been identified as underlying scientific reasoning and other high-level cognition, for example, analogy, statistical learning, categorization, imitation, inhibition. Goswami, 2008. However, due to space limitations, we focus on what we argue are the two most critical mechanisms in coding on strategy development to illustrate the importance of individual-level cognitive abilities. Encoding is the process of representing information and its context in memory as a result of attention to stimuli. Chen, 2007, Siegler, 1989. As such, it is a central mechanism in scientific reasoning because we must represent information before we can reason about it, and the quality and process of representation can affect reasoning. Importantly, there are significant developmental changes in the ability to encode the relevant features that will lead to sound reasoning and problem solving. Siegler, 1983, 1985. Encoding abilities improve with the acquisition of encoding strategies and with increases in children's domain knowledge. Siegler, 1989. Young children often encode irrelevant features due to limited domain knowledge. Gentner, Lowenstein, and Thompson, 2003. For example, when solving problems to make predictions about the state of a two-arm balance beam, i.e., tip left, tip right, or balance, children often erroneously encode distance to the fulcrum and amount of weight as a single factor, decreasing the likelihood of producing a correct solution, which requires weight and distance to be encoded and considered separately as causal factors, while recognizing non-causal factors such as color. Omzel, Goodman, Savoy, and Clark, 1996, Siegler, 1983. Increased domain knowledge helps children assess more effectively what information is and is not necessary to encode. Further, children's encoding often improves with the acquisition of encoding strategies. For example, if a child is attempting to recall the location of an item in a complex environment, she may err in encoding only the features of the object itself without encoding its relative position. With experience, she may encode the relations between the target item and other objects. For example, the star is in front of the box, a strategy known as Q-learning. Encoding object position and relative position increases the likelihood of later recall and is an example of how encoding better information is more important than simply encoding more information. Chen, 2007, Newcomb and Huttenlocher, 2000. Effective encoding is dependent on directing attention to relevant information, which in turn leads to accurate representations that can guide reasoning. Across a variety of tasks, experts are more likely to attend to critical elements in problem solving, and less likely to attend to irrelevant information, compared to novices. Gobbett, 2005. Domain knowledge plays an important role in helping to guide attention to important features. Parents often direct a child's attention to critical problem features during problem solving. For example, a parent may keep track of which items have been counted in order to help a child organize counting. Sachs, Guberman, and Gearhart, 1987. Instructional interventions in which children were directed towards critical elements in problem solving improved their attention to these features. Kloos and Van Orden, 2005. Although domain knowledge is helpful in directing attention to critical features, it may sometimes limit novel reasoning in a domain and limit the extent to which attention is paid to disconfirming evidence. Lee and Clare, 2006. Finally, self-generated activity improves encoding. Self-generation of information from memory, rather than passive attention, is associated with more effective encoding because it recruits greater attentional resources than passive encoding. Chi, 2009. Strategies are sequences of procedural actions used to achieve a goal. Siegler, 1996. In the context of scientific reasoning, strategies are the steps that guide children from their initial state, for example, a question about the effects of weight and distance in balancing a scale, to a goal state, for example, understanding the nature of the relationship between variables. We will briefly examine two components of strategy development, strategy acquisition and strategy selection. Strategies are particularly important in the development of scientific reasoning. Children often actively explore objects in a manner that is like hypothesis testing. However, these exploration strategies are not systematic investigations in which variables are manipulated and controlled as informal hypothesis testing strategies. Clare, 2000. The acquisition of increasingly optimal strategies for hypothesis testing, inference, and evidence evaluation leads to more effective scientific reasoning that allows children to construct more veridical knowledge. New strategies are added to the repertoire of possible strategies through discovery, instruction, or other social interactions. Chen, 2007, Govan, 2001, Siegler, 1996. There is evidence that children can discover strategies on their own. Chen, 2007. Children often discover new strategies when they experience an insight into a new way of solving a familiar problem. For example, 10 and 11-year-olds discovered new strategies for evaluating causal relations between variables in a computerized task only after creating different cars, for example, comparing the effects of engine size, and testing them. Schäuble, 1990. Similarly, when asked to determine the cause of a chemical reaction, children discovered new experimentation strategies only after several weeks. Kuhn and Phelps, 1982. Over time, existing strategies may be modified to reduce time and complexity of implementation, for example, eliminating redundant steps in a problem-solving sequence. Clare, 1984. For example, determining causal relations among variables requires more time when experimentation is unsystematic. In order to identify which variables resulted in the fastest car, children often constructed up to 25 cars, whereas an adult scientist identified the fastest car after constructing only 7 cars. Schäuble, 1990. Children also gain new strategies through social interaction, by being explicitly taught a strategy, imitating a strategy, or by collaborating in problem solving. Govan, 2001. For example, when a parent asks a child questions about events in a photograph, the parent evokes memories of the event and helps to structure the child's understanding of the depicted event, a process called conversational remembering. Middleton, 1997. Conversational remembering improves children's recall of events and often leads to children spontaneously using this strategy. Parent conversations about event structures improve children's memory for these structures. For example, questions about a child's day at school help to structure this event and improved recall. Nelson, 1996. Children also learn new strategies by solving problems cooperatively with adults. In a sorting task, preschool children were more likely to improve their classification strategies after working with their mothers. Freund, 1990. Further, children who worked with their parents on a hypothesis testing task were more likely to identify causal variables than children who worked alone because parents helped children construct valid experiments, keep data records, and repeat experiments. Gleason and Schäuble, 2000. Children also acquire strategies by interacting with an adult modeling a novel strategy. Middle school children acquired a reading comprehension strategy, for example, anticipating the ending of a story, after seeing it modeled by their teacher, Halensker, Brown, and Campione, 1993. Additionally, children can acquire new strategies from interactions with other children. Monitoring other children during problem solving improves a child's understanding of the task and appears to improve how they evaluate their own performance. Brownell and Carragher, 1991. Elementary school children who collaborated with other students to solve the balance scale task outperformed students who worked alone. Pine and Messer, 1998. 10-year-olds working in dyads were more likely to discuss their strategies than children working alone, and these discussions were associated with generating better hypotheses than children working alone. Teasley, 1995. More than one strategy may be useful for solving a problem, which requires a means to select among candidate strategies. One suggestion is that this process occurs by adaptive selection. In adaptive selection, strategies that match features of the problem are candidates for selection. One component of selection is that newer strategies tend to have a slightly higher priority for use when compared to older strategies. Siegler, 1996. Successful selection is made on the basis of the effectiveness of the strategy and its cost, for example, speed, and children tend to choose the fastest, most accurate strategy available, i.e., the most adaptive strategy. Cognitive mechanisms provide the basic investigation and inferential tools used in scientific reasoning. The ability to reason about knowledge and the means for obtaining and evaluating knowledge provide powerful tools that augment children's reasoning. Metacognitive abilities such as these may help explain some of the discrepancies between early scientific reasoning abilities and limitations in older children, as well as some of the developmental changes in encoding and strategy use. Sodian, Zaitchik, and Carey, 1991, argue that two basic skills related to early metacognitive acquisitions are needed for scientific reasoning. First, children need to understand that inferences can be drawn from evidence. The theory of mind literature, for example, Wellman, Cross, and Watson, 2001, suggests that it is not until the age of 4 that children understand that beliefs and knowledge are based on perceptual experience, i.e., evidence. As noted earlier, experimental work demonstrates that preschoolers can use evidence to make judgments about simple causal relationships. Gopnik, Sobel, Schultz, and Gilmore, 2001, Schultz and Bonowitz, 2007, Schultz and Gopnik, 2004, Schultz, Gopnik, and Gilmore, 2007. Similarly, several classic studies show that children as young as 6 can succeed in simple scientific reasoning tasks. Children between 6 and 9 can discriminate between a conclusive and an inclusive test of a simple hypothesis. Sodian et al., 1991. Children as young as 5 can form a causal hypothesis based on a pattern of evidence, and even 4-year-olds seem to understand some of the principles of causal reasoning. Ruffman, Perner, Olson, and Doherty, 1993. Second, according to Sodian et al., 1991, children need to understand that inference is itself a mechanism with which further knowledge can be acquired. 4-year-olds base their knowledge on perceptual experiences, whereas 6-year-olds understand that the testimony of others can also be used in making inferences. Sodian and Wimmer, 1987. Other research suggests that children younger than 6 can make inferences based on testimony, but in very limited circumstances. Koenig, Clement, and Harris, 2004. These findings may explain why, by the age of 6, children are able to succeed on simple causal reasoning, hypothesis testing, and evidence evaluation tasks. Research with older children, however, has revealed that 8 to 12-year-olds have limitations in their abilities to a. generate unconfounded experiments, b. disconfirm hypotheses, c. keep accurate and systematic records, and d. evaluate evidence. Clare, Fay, and Dunbar, 1993, Kuhn, Garcia Mila, Zohar, and Anderson, 1995, Schäuble, 1990, 1996, Zimmerman, Raghavan, and Sartoris, 2003. For example, Schäuble, 1990, presented children aged 9 to 11 with a computerized task in which they had to determine which of 5 factors affect the speed of racing cars. Children often varied several factors at once, only 22% of the experiments were classified as valid, and they often drew conclusions consistent with belief rather than the evidence generated. They used a positive test strategy, testing variables believed to influence speed, for example, engine size, and not testing those believed to be non-causal, for example, color. Some children recorded features without outcomes, or outcomes without features, but most wrote down nothing at all, relying on memory for details of experiments carried out over an 8-week period. Although the performance differences between younger and older children may be interpreted as potentially contradictory, the differing cognitive and metacognitive demands of tasks used to study scientific reasoning at different ages may account for some of the disconnect in conclusions. Even though the simple tasks given to preschoolers and young children require them to understand evidence as a source of knowledge, such tasks require the cognitive abilities of induction and pattern recognition, but only limited metacognitive abilities. In contrast, the tasks used to study the development of scientific reasoning in older children, and adults, are more demanding and focused on hypothetico-deductive reasoning. They include more variables, involve more complex causal structures, require varying levels of domain knowledge, and are negotiated across much longer time scales. Moreover, the tasks given to older children and adults involve the acquisition, selection, and coordination of investigation strategies, combining background knowledge with empirical evidence. The results of investigation activities are then used in the acquisition, selection, and coordination of evidence evaluation and inference strategies. With respect to encoding, increases in task complexity require attending to more information and making judgments about which features are relevant. This encoding happens in the context of prior knowledge and, in many cases, it is also necessary to inhibit prior knowledge. Zimmerman and Croker, in Press. Sodian and Bullock, 2008, also argue that mature scientific reasoning involves the metastrategic process of being able to think explicitly about hypotheses and evidence, and that this skill is not fully mastered until adolescence at the very earliest. According to Amsel et al. 2008, metacognitive competence is important for hypothetical reasoning. These conclusions are consistent with Kuhn's, 1989, 2005, 2011a, argument that the defining feature of scientific thinking is the set of cognitive and metacognitive skills involved in differentiating and coordinating theory and evidence. Kuhn argues that the effective coordination of theory and evidence depends on three metacognitive abilities: a. the ability to encode and represent evidence and theory separately, so that relations between them can be recognized; b. the ability to treat theories as independent objects of thought, i.e., rather than a representation of the way things are; and c. the ability to recognize that theories can be false, setting aside the acceptance of a theory so evidence can be assessed to determine the veridicality of a theory. When we consider these cognitive and metacognitive abilities in the larger social context, it is clear that skills that are highly valued by the scientific community may be at odds with the cultural and intuitive views of the individual reasoner. Limke, 2001. Thus, it often takes time for conceptual change to occur. Evidence is not just evaluated in the context of the science investigation and science classroom, but within personal and community values. Conceptual change also takes place in the context of an individual's personal epistemology, which can undergo developmental transitions. For example, Sandoval, 2005. Returning to the encoding and retrieval of information relevant to scientific reasoning tasks, many studies demonstrate that both children and adults are not always aware of their memory limitations while engaged in investigation tasks. For example, Carey, Evans, Honda, J., and Unger, 1989, Dunbar and Clare, 1989, Garcia Mila and Anderson, 2007, Gleason and Schäuble, 2000, Siegler and Liebert, 1975, Trafton and Trickett, 2001. Canary and Miller, 2004, found that children differentially recorded the results of experiments, depending on familiarity or strength of prior beliefs. For example, 10 to 14-year-olds recorded more data points when experimenting with unfamiliar items, for example, using a force meter to determine the factors affecting the force produced by the weight and surface area of boxes, than with familiar items, for example, using a stopwatch to experiment with pendulums. Overall, children are less likely than adults to record experimental designs and outcomes, or to review notes they do keep, despite task demands that clearly necessitate a reliance on external memory aids. Children are often asked to judge their memory abilities, and memory plays an important role in scientific reasoning. Children's understanding of memory as a fallible process develops over middle childhood. Joswal and Dodson, 2009, Kreutzer, Leonard, and Flavel, 1975. Young children view all strategies on memory tasks as equally effective, whereas 8 to 10-year-olds start to discriminate between strategies, and 12-year-olds know which strategies work best. Justice, 1986, Schneider, 1986. The development of metamemory continues through adolescence, Schneider, 2008, so there may not be a particular age that memory and metamemory limitations are no longer a consideration for children and adolescents engaged in complex scientific reasoning tasks. However, it seems likely that meta-memory limitations are more profound for children under 10 to 12 years. Likewise, the acquisition of other metacognitive and metastrategic skills is a gradual process. Early strategies for coordinating theory and evidence are replaced with better ones, but there is not a stage-like change from using an older strategy to a newer one. Multiple strategies are concurrently available, so the process of change is very much like Siegler's, 1996, overlapping waves model, Kuhn et al., 1995. However, metastrategic competency does not appear to routinely develop in the absence of instruction. Kuhn and her colleagues have incorporated the use of specific practice opportunities and prompts to help children develop these types of competencies. For example, Kuhn, Black, Selman, and Kaplan, 2000, incorporated performance-level practice and metastrategic level practice for 6th to 8th grade students. Performance-level exercise consisted of standard exploration of the task environment, whereas meta-level practice consisted of scenarios in which two individuals disagreed about the effect of a particular feature in a multivariable situation. Students then evaluated different strategies that could be used to resolve the disagreement. Such scenarios were provided twice a week during the course of 10 weeks. Although no performance differences were found between the two types of practice with respect to the number of valid inferences, there were more sizable differences in measures of understanding of task objectives and strategies, i.e., metastrategic understanding. Similarly, Zohar and Palad, 2008, focused instruction in the control of variable strategy, CVS, on metastrategic competence. 5th graders were given a computerized task in which they had to determine the effects of 5 variables on seed germination. Students in the control group were taught about seed germination, and students in the experimental group were given a metastrategic knowledge intervention over several sessions. The intervention consisted of describing CVS, discussing when it should be used, and discussing what features of a task indicate that CVS should be used. A second computerized task on potato growth was used to assess near transfer. A physical task in which participants had to determine which factors affect the distance a ball will roll was used to assess far transfer. The experimental group showed gains on both the strategic and the metastrategic level. The latter was measured by asking participants to explain what they had done. These gains were still apparent on the near and far transfer tasks when they were administered 3 months later. Moreover, low academic achievers showed the largest gains. It is clear from these studies that although meta-level competencies may not develop routinely, they can certainly be learned via explicit instruction. Metacognitive abilities are necessary precursors to sophisticated scientific thinking, and represent one of the ways in which children, adults, and professional scientists differ. In order for children's behavior to go beyond demonstrating the correctness of one's existing beliefs, for example, Dunbar and Clare, 1989, it is necessary for meta-level competencies to be developed and practiced, Kuhn, 2005. With metacognitive control over the processes involved, children, and adults, can change what they believe based on evidence and, in doing so, are aware not only that they are changing a belief, but also know why they are changing a belief. Thus, sophisticated reasoning involves both the use of various strategies involved in hypothesis testing, induction, inference, and evidence evaluation, and a meta-level awareness of when, how, and why one should engage in these strategies.